the dark haze. Ladies of the night with eyes of red, vampires in the alleys where good men dread, wolfmen howling beneath the pale moon. But justice is coming and coming soon. From saloons to graveyards where evil sleeps, they walk among us, secrets they keep, nightmare hunters with souls ablaze, cleaning up this town through the dark haze. Cryptids themselves, yet they stand tall against the darkness, answering the call for every lost soul, every whispered prayer. They fight for the light in the midnight air. From saloons to graveyards where evil sleeps, they walk among us, secrets they keep, nightmare hunters with souls ablaze, cleaning up this town through the dark haze. The night is young, the hunt begins, for against the darkness where hope never ends.
Good evening, folks, and welcome to another edition of the Nightmare Hunters podcast. We're glad to be back with you guys. I had to take a little bit of time off. Robbie had a couple health issues. Doc's been really busy, and I just had a bunch of crap going on, and I apologize, but we're back, and hopefully better than ever. So I appreciate you guys joining us. I'm your host, D.A. Robertson. As always, I'm joined from my brother from another mother, Robbie Jed Rains. But before we jump into the deep woods and dark hollows tonight, we always want to take a moment for you guys, for our community. So if you guys got a prayer request for yourself, for a family, for a friend, or just anyone you know that's going through a hard time, let us know in the comments, because we pray for each other around here, and we've got a few folks on the list this week, and we're going to be keeping all of them in our thoughts and prayers. Of course, Miss Lene is having some migraine issues, so I pray for her. I pray for Robbie and Doc. They both got a lot of stuff going on. Remember Maggie, a good friend of ours that's going through some serious issues. My sister Becky, who has started her chemo treatment. Stephen Miller and his family, keep them in your prayers. Harold G. and his family, and of course Rodney that's in the chat tonight and his family as well. So, Robbie, how you doing tonight, brother?
I'm doing good. For once, I'm actually doing good.
I'm proud of you, brother. How much weight have you lost?
I was 262 when I started, and I'm down to 226 as of yesterday.
That is awesome, brother. Congrats. That's a lot of work to do, especially at our age.
Yeah.
Well, you ready to jump into this?
Ready when you is.
All right. Well, folks, I am going to bring this thumbnail up before I get started. There are some cases in cryptozoology where the first question always seems obvious. What did the witness see? Was it a bear? Was it a Bigfoot? Was it some other animal that was simply observed under unusual circumstances? Usually, that's where we begin, because before we start considering explanations, we need to understand exactly what the witness claims to have happened. But tonight's case is a little different. Before we can seriously ask what the Cowman of Copalis Beach might have been, we have to answer a much more fundamental question. Did this encounter even actually happen? Because the deeper we went into this story, the more we realized that we weren't simply investigating an alleged creature encounter anymore. We were investigating the story itself, trying to trace where it came from, who actually witnessed the events, and when the account first appeared, and whether the extraordinary details that have made the Cowman of Copalis Beach such a memorable piece of Bigfoot history can be traced back to something that we can independently verify. And believe me, there are plenty of extraordinary details. There's a young child who reportedly sees something hairy and foul-smelling near a barbed wire fence and gives it the name that will eventually follow this case for decades. There's strange hair reportedly recovered from that same fence. There's another child who believes that something was following him through the woods. There are alleged sightings, enormous footprints, strange vocalizations, gunshots, something reportedly approaching the family home, and eventually an encounter outside a child's bedroom window that takes the story into territory that's genuinely disturbing. But taken all together, it sounds like one of the most remarkable prolonged Bigfoot encounters ever reported. But there's a problem. When we start asking the questions we would ask in any investigation, things become considerably less certain. Who are these witnesses? What are their original statements? What physical evidence still exists? How much of the story can be independently corroborated? Can we trace the account back to the people who supposedly experienced it, or are we ultimately tracing one retelling back to another retelling until the trail disappears? Those questions don't automatically make this story false, though. They don't prove somebody invented it either. What they do mean is that we can't simply accept the story because it's been repeated often enough to become part of Bigfoot lore. That's not how we investigate these cases. So tonight, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to present the Cowman case to you piece by piece, and we're going to investigate two mysteries at the same time. First, we're going to examine what allegedly happened to this family near Copalis Beach, Washington State. Then, we're going to turn the investigation around and examine the story itself. We want you guys paying close attention tonight because by the time we reach a jury deliberation, we're going to ask you to render your verdict on a question that's considerably harder than simply asking whether you believe in Bigfoot. We're going to ask if we've established that there was ever a case here to begin with. Welcome to Open Case Files, so let's open the file. If you're joining us for the first time, Open Case Files is a little different from the way we normally approach a subject. We're not here to tell you what you're supposed to believe, and we're certainly not going to hand you a conclusion before you've had the opportunity to examine the evidence yourself. We're going to lay this case out the way we would approach any investigation. We'll establish what's been claimed, examine the witnesses and the available evidence, identify problems and inconsistencies when we find them, and then consider a reasonable alternative explanations. Then we'll let you guys decide what you think the evidence actually supports. And that last part is the important part because you are the jury. We're going to tell you where we land when we reach the end of the investigation, but our verdict doesn't have to be yours. In fact, we'd much rather have somebody disagree with us because they've carefully examined the evidence than simply agree with us because they accepted everything we said. That's why we want you to be involved throughout tonight's show. If you're watching live, get into the chat and tell us what you're seeing as each exhibit comes into the evidence. If you're watching the replay, use the comments and tell us where your opinion changed, what evidence you found persuasive, what you rejected, and most importantly, why. Chicken Bird, thank you, and thank you for the gifts. And who was the other? Was Bobby? Yeah, thank you, Bobby. Thank you guys all for the gifted subs. So again, if you're watching the replay, tell us in the comments where your opinion changed, what you found persuasive, and what you rejected. And again, most importantly, why. We don't just want your conclusion. I want to hear your reasoning. What got you there? And while you're there, take a second to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and if you haven't already, share the episode with somebody who enjoys Bigfoot, Sasquatch, cryptozoology, unexplained encounters, historical mysteries, or simply digging into strange cases and following the evidence where it leads. If you're already part of the Nightmare Hunter Nation, thank you guys for continuing to support what we're doing here. Every like, comment, share, subscription, and channel membership helps us keep these investigations going and helps new people find the show. Now, there's one thing we want to establish before we begin. We're not approaching the Cowman story with the intention of debunking it. We're also not approaching it with the intention of proving it. Those are conclusions, and conclusions belong at the end of the investigation, not at the beginning. What interests us about the Cowman of Copalis Beach is that this story has circulated through the Bigfoot cryptozoology community for years, decades really, and it contains virtually everything you'd expect from a truly compelling encounter narrative. It's got multiple witnesses. It has repeated activity. It has physical traces left behind, unusual behavior, escalating encounters, and a creature that apparently becomes increasingly bold as the story progresses. If the account happens substantially as reported, it deserves serious attention. But repetition is not corroboration. That's a distinction we're going to come back to several times tonight, because the story doesn't become better evidence simply because 1,000 websites repeat it. If those 1,000 versions ultimately trace back to the same account, we still only have one source. So tonight we're going to separate two questions that are very often treated as though they're the same. Could something like the Cowman exist? And did the events known as the Cowman of Copalis Beach actually occur? And those are completely different questions. Tonight, we're investigating the second one. We're going to begin with the story as it has been presented, because before we start pulling an account apart, we think it's only fair that we understand what the account actually says. Then, exhibit by exhibit, we'll start asking the questions that determine evidentiary weight we think that we can reasonably give it. Some of those questions may strengthen the case, some might weaken it, and some may leave us exactly where investigators occasionally have to be comfortable standing, with an unanswered question. But that's okay. The purpose of an investigation isn't to force an answer. It's to find out what the evidence can actually support. So y'all grab your coffee, get comfortable, keep that chat going, and don't make up your mind too early. We've got a strange case ahead of us tonight, and before this one is over, I suspect the biggest mystery may not be what was supposedly walking through those Washington woods. The biggest mystery may be how the story got here in the first place. This is the Nightmare Hunters Podcast, episode 423. This is Open Case Files number 3, and tonight we're reopening the Cowman of Copalis Beach. Let's get to work. Robbie, would you take us the case in brief? I really wanted to have you do that, mainly because you told me earlier that you weren't that familiar with this case.
Nope, so I'll be glad to do that. So the case brief, before we start introducing exhibits, we want to make sure everybody knows the basic story we're investigating tonight. Because we know some of you are probably very familiar with the Cowman of Copalis Beach, while others, like myself, may be hearing it in name for the first time. And as I get into this, it may become familiar to me. I may have heard it in a different name, but as of right now, I'm kind of unfamiliar with this one. So for those of you that may be your first time coming to this case completely cold, here's the story in the broad stroke. The account is generally placed near Copalis Beach in Grays Harbor County, Washington, during the 1960s, and centers on the family living in a heavily wooded rural area. The names most commonly associated with the story aren't necessarily the names we're going to be able to independently verify, and that's going to become important later. So for now, I'm simply going to use the names that were provided to us in this account. According to the story, the trouble begins when a 4-year-old boy named Tim reports seeing a large, hairy creature caught or tangled near a barbed wire fence. The child calls the creature the Cowman, and although his mother reportedly doesn't see it herself, she's said to have noticed a powerful foul odor and movement of the fence. Not long afterward, another child, 12-year-old John Jr., reportedly becomes convinced that something large is following him through the woods on his way home. The children's father, John Sr., eventually investigates the fence and reportedly discovers a substantial amount of coarse reddish-brown hair tangled in the wire, possibly with tissue attached. And from there, according to the story, things escalate. There are reported encounters in the woods. There are strange vocalizations. There's gunfire. Something apparently begins approaching the family's home. An enormous human-like footprint is reportedly discovered, along with other unusual signs. And eventually, the creature allegedly appears outside young Tim's bedroom window. By the time a story reaches its conclusion, we're no longer talking about somebody catching a glimpse of a strange animal crossing a road. We're talking about a prolonged series of encounters involving several members of one family, alleged physical evidence, repeated activity around their home, and behavior suggesting that whatever they believed was out there had developed an unsettling interest in the youngest child. If all that happened substantially as reported, the Cowman of Copalis County would deserve a place among the most extraordinarily prolonged Sasquatch encounters ever recorded. But there's one hell of a word citing right in the middle of that sentence. If. Because everything I just told you is the story. It isn't the evidence. And for the rest of tonight, our job is going to be to figuring out how much of the story we can actually support. Now that everybody is familiar with the case and up to snuff, we're investigating the case. So let's begin with Exhibit A.
You want to take Exhibit A, or you want me to do it?
I can do it if you want me to.
Oh, go right ahead, man.
So, Exhibit A.
Folks, before he begins, though, I have slides for each exhibit and each segment. When I'm talking, it's kind of hard for me to switch the slides because I got to take my focus on off my notes. And so I will try to do better about that, try to not just leave the slide up the whole time. So I'm going to leave the slides up for about a minute while he's talking. And then with each new slide, we'll, again, leave it up for about a minute. So go ahead, Robbie.
All right. Exhibit A, the source. Where did the Cowman story come from? All right, now that everybody knows the basic story that we're investigating tonight, we want to start somewhere that may seem a little unusual for a Bigfoot investigation. We're not starting at the barbed wire fence. We're not starting with the reported hair, and we're not even starting with the creature. We're starting with the source. The reason is pretty simple. Before we can decide how much weight to give any witness statement, we need to know who actually made that statement and how many people it passed through before it reached us. That's especially important with the Cowman of Copalis Beach because when we started tracing the story backwards, we discovered that the account most of us know isn't presented as a first-hand account from the man at the center of the encounter. The surviving story is attributed to a writer named S.D. Baker, also identified in later references as Shannon D. Baker. Baker begins his account by talking about his father, a lifelong timber worker who eventually owned his own logging operation and employed men who spent considerable amounts of time working in the remote wilderness. One of those employees was a foreman Baker identifies only by the pseudonym John. According to Baker, when he was a child, he remembered hearing bits and pieces of conversations among the men at his father's mill about something frightening that had happened before Baker himself was born. Whatever it was, apparently it involved John, but Baker says the adults wouldn't discuss the details with him because he was a kid and his father didn't want him becoming afraid of the woods. Years later, Baker said he finally asked his father about those conversations, and after some prodding, his father finally told him the story. Now, let's stop right there, because from an investigative standpoint, that matters. If we're understanding the provenance correctly, we're not listening to John tell us what happened to John. We're listening to Baker tell us what his father told him that John and members of John's family experienced. That would be called second and third hand knowledge. That doesn't make the story false. Plenty of completely true stories reach us secondhand, and there's nothing inherently wrong or inherently suspicious about somebody recounting something a trusted family member told them. What it does create is distance between us and the original witness, and every bit of distance creates another opportunity for details to be forgotten, misunderstood, compressed, emphasized, or unintentionally changed. There's another wrinkle, though. And this is where the source history becomes interesting. By June of 2012, members of the Bigfoot forums were discussing the Cowman story and specifically remembered finding what they described as its original form in the older BFF 1.0 forum.
I used to be a member of the Bigfoot forums. I remember reading this story then.
I think I was too at one time also. One member said the account had appeared there is an opening post of a thread and importantly remembered follow-up questions and answers with the author. That same discussion says the author presented the story as something told to him by his father and his father's friends. That's useful because it gives us something more substantial than simply finding 20 modern websites repeating the same story. It tells us that an earlier version existed in an online Bigfoot community, and that people who had access to that older forum remembered interacting with the person who posted it. I'm assuming that's Baker is what we're going
Baker
with on that.
posted it.
But but notice what it still doesn't give us. It doesn't give us John. It doesn't give us John's wife. It doesn't give us his children. It doesn't give us a contemporary police report, a newspaper article from the time, photographs of the alleged damage, photographs of the cast, or the reported footprints, or physical evidence we can put on the table to examine. At least we hadn't found those things yet. And we want to phrase that carefully, because there's a huge difference between saying something doesn't exist and saying we haven't been able to locate it. If somebody watching tonight knows of a contemporary documentation that we've missed, we genuinely want to see it. That's one of the reasons we involve all of you in these investigations. There's something else that we find interesting about the way this story spread. By January of 2009, a lengthy version attributed to S.D. Baker was already being reposted everywhere else, or elsewhere online, under the title "The Cowman of Copalis Beach." And by 2012 and 2013, people within the Bigfoot community were already referring to it as a particularly memorable or frightening Bigfoot story. So we can establish that the story didn't suddenly appear last year on TikTok or get invented for some recent YouTube video. It has an online history going back for many years, and apparently farther back than the surviving copies that we've been able to examine. But age isn't a corroboration either. That's where we think people sometimes get themselves into trouble when researching these cases. If we find the same account on 10 websites, we don't necessarily have 10 sources. If all 10 copied it from Baker, we have one source that has been reproduced 10 times. That's why we're beginning here. For the rest of the night, though, whenever we say according to the account, we want you to remember what that means. We're talking about an account attributed by S.D. Baker, who says he received the story primarily through his father concerning events experienced by John and his family years earlier. That's our evidentiary starting point. It doesn't mean that we throw the case away. It means we put an asterisk beside it and keep it for the investigation. So,
Robbie, how much weight do you personally give a detailed secondhand account?
Well, that depends on the situation. I mean, because one detailed secondhand account can be very accurate and very reliable, while another can be completely inaccurate and unreliable. It depends on your source, and I would say that depends on Baker and how credible he is. Is he somebody who's looking for his 15 minutes of fame, or is he?
It never struck me as that. Neither does the family. In fact, they did not give their real names because they didn't want the attention.
And that lends credence to, because if somebody's looking for that, they want their names all. It's just like case in point, like we always talk about, and nobody ever came forward and said, "Hey, I'm Bauman." You know,
exactly.
So, like I said, I say you have to take it with a grain of salt and just look at your sources. And if the source of the secondhand information you deem reliable, then I'd say it's just as reliable as far as that person believes it. That doesn't necessarily mean that what he's recounting is true. It just means that what he's recounting, he believes to be true from the source that he got it from.
Absolutely. And folks, these investigators' questions that we're going to be asking, they apply to you guys as much as they do to us. So feel free to chime in and keep these questions in mind, because they are very pertinent to the case. So does Baker's description of hearing adults discuss the incident when he was young add anything to the credibility of the story, or is that still ultimately part of Baker's own testimony? At this point, we've got a second, possibly third-hand story, but it's consistent. So at this point, I would at least look at it. If this story came to me from, well, let's say, Robbie, you and I were having dinner over at the barbecue place, and this old boy approaches us and says, "I know an old boy who knows an old boy that had this happen on his property." We'd at least go look.
Yeah, and I think that I think it's like what we said. I think Baker at least believes that the story is credible. So from his standpoint of what he is told, I don't think he's embellishing anything. I think he is genuinely telling what he has been told. So it still kind of takes us, full circle back to how credible is the original source,
Right.
which, obviously
I actually
we haven't got
personally
there
give
yet.
quite a bit of credibility to the original story because it predates all this TikTok and AI stuff.
Right. And that's where I was getting to with that, because this is before the age of everything online. So, you've got to look at, and that's why we've talked about it. And I don't know how many times you and I and Doc have all said it, back then when, people weren't looking for their internet fame or anything like that. When somebody said, "Hey, I saw something in the woods," most of the time people believed them because there was no reason for these people to lie. It wasn't like they were gaining anything from it. They weren't, a lot of times they could have lost their credibility because back then your word was your bond. And if you were deemed to be somebody who was not trustworthy, things were done with a handshake back then. And if you couldn't trust somebody, that could mess up your entire life at that point.
Yeah, we got some great comments here. Leonard Alpha says Baker's hearsay may possibly identify a first-hand witness, depending on what Baker can recall the overhear. Yeah, exactly. And another great one here from Don. You can't write off anything till you check everything out. Absolutely. And even as a cop, if we were having lunch, Barbie and I were both in uniform together, we're having lunch, and someone comes up and goes, "Hey, my next door neighbor reported somebody that was screaming bloody murder. It sounded like they're getting beat to death." We're probably going to call it in and go check it out. I mean, even if it's a secondhand report, you still can't just ignore stuff like that.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, especially in the line of work that you and I and Rodney and some of the others in the chat were in, you can't, if you just say, he didn't see it, he wasn't there, just secondhand, it could mean somebody's life.
Exactly.
So,
Robbie, how important is the absence of a statement directly from John or from any of the family members that were involved?
I mean, it's an issue, but it's not a nail in the coffin of saying this is absolutely. I mean, it's an issue that it's not there, but when this was happening, they may have never even called the police because they might have thought, oh, they'll just think we're crazy. So just because there's not a sworn statement or anything that's, like I said, it's not the nail in the coffin of saying, well, it's fake. It's just, it could be just there's just not one. Not because there's any nefarious purpose behind it. It's just for whatever reason, there's not one. There's not a sworn statement about my account.
Right, exactly. And you were a kid when it happened.
Yeah. So, but that doesn't mean that it didn't happen. That just means, and I guess technically the police were called because my stepdad being a deputy sheriff, but there was never an official report filed about it. So, but that doesn't mean that it didn't happen. That just means, there's not a report filed. So I don't think it's an issue as far as we don't have his first, because there may be stuff in what he saw, what he experienced that, help out a lot, which I'm sure there would have been. But that doesn't mean
we're going to get to that. Trust me. Anyway.
But it doesn't mean that, the things were not on the up and up just because there's not a statement.
Exactly. And folks, one thing I want you guys to bear in mind is just because the story appears on dozens of websites, if they all trace back to that one story written by Baker, that we don't have a bunch of independent sources. We have one source that a lot of people have cited. But at this point, this is for every one of y'all, and Robbie, because Robbie has done investigations. What evidence would you most want to find right now before giving this story any more weight? We remember we're hearing a second-hand story here, possibly a third-hand story. What evidence would you want to have right now, right in front of you, smoking gun, before you would give this more weight? Without investigating, without going further, what would make you think this story was more believable from just what we have?
From just what we have, to me, what would make it more believable is if there were samples taken, photographs of the track, things like that. That would, to me, I mean, and when I say that, I'm not saying that I don't believe this case. I'm just saying for that, like you said, smoking gun, that would be something that I would say, yeah, okay.
Well, for somebody that actually was there.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So keep those questions in the back of your mind, because now that we've established where the story comes from, we're going to temporarily kind of set that source problem to the side and do something important. We're going to give the account the benefit of the doubt. So for the next several exhibits, we're going to examine the events substantially as Baker reported them, and ask what the story looks like if we assume, for the sake of the investigation, that the family really did experience what was described. Then, later tonight, we'll come back and test that assumption. So with the report established, it's time to go back where the Cowman of Copalis Beach story really began, with a 4-year-old and a barbed wire fence, and something that the child didn't have another name for. So let me put that next slide up, and I will get this started.
DA, while you're reading that one, I'll be right back.
Okay. This is Exhibit B, the first sighting. Tim and the barbed wire fence. Now that we've established where the Cowman story came from, we're going to do exactly what we promised before the break in Exhibit A. For the moment, we're going to set aside the problems with the provenance and examine the events as they're presented in Baker's account. Because if we're going to evaluate this story fairly, we can't spend the entire investigation dismissing every detail simply because it came to us secondhand. According to the account, the first person in the family to encounter anything unusual wasn't John, and it wasn't another experienced woodsman who might have been expected to recognize the wildlife around him. This was a 4-year-old little boy named Tim. And I know as a 4-year-old, I had a pretty active imagination. And that generally goes with most toddlers, most kids that age. But at this point, we're gonna take it at face value. So John reportedly returned home from work on a Friday evening when Tim told him that what he'd seen. He called it a cowman walking near the edge of the family's field earlier that afternoon. John initially thought the boy meant cowboy, which is a perfectly reasonable assumption when you're trying to interpret something being told to you by a 4-year-old. But according to the account, some of the family's neighbors wore cowboy hats while they worked outside. So John asked whether the man Tim had seen had been wearing one. Let me take this down, back down. Tim corrected him. He wasn't trying to say cowboy. He meant cowman. When John asked what that meant, Tim explained it in the kind of language you'd expect from a kid that age. He said the thing was furry and stinky like the cows. Now, that description interests me, but probably not for the reason you might expect. Tim hadn't come running into the house yelling that he'd seen a Bigfoot. He didn't describe a Sasquatch. And at 4 years old, I have no idea whether he would have even understood what that word meant. According to the story, he simply reached for something familiar and invented a label that made sense to him. He said cowman. And you got to remember, this happened somewhere around 1960. So the phrase Bigfoot had only been coined in 1957, 3 years earlier, with the Jerry Crews incident. So the word Bigfoot might not even have been something this kid was ever exposed to. So that's potentially interesting from a witness interview standpoint, because young children frequently describe unfamiliar things by comparing them with things they already understand. And at the same time, his age creates, an obvious problem. 4-year-olds can misunderstand what they're seeing. They have vivid imaginations, and they're not necessarily reliable when it comes to estimating size, distance, or even interpreting unfamiliar animals.
Kind of like a bear took care of me and fed me berries.
Exactly. Great point. So if all we had was Tim's statement, we wouldn't have much of a case. But according to Baker's account, Tim's mother provides the first piece of potential corroboration. She reportedly told John that Tim had been playing on the porch that afternoon, and when he suddenly came running inside, excitingly telling her that the cowman was stuck on the fence, she went outside with him to see what he was talking about. But by the time she got out on the porch, whatever Tim thought he'd seen was gone. She did, however, report two things, and these are both very critical for you guys to keep in mind. The first thing she reported was an extremely strong smell, which we all know is associated a lot of times with Bigfoot stories. Even though she wasn't reporting a Bigfoot story, the strong smell was compelling. She compared the smell to wet dogs and garbage. Where have we heard that before? The second was the fence itself. Tim pointed toward the field and told her the cowman had gotten loose, and she reportedly saw the top strand of barbed wire shaken up and down like something had recently pulled against it and let it go. She didn't report seeing a creature herself, and according to the account, she didn't notice anything else unusual. That's where we want to stop and look at this like an investigator rather than just a storyteller. We don't have two eyewitnesses to a creature. We have one eyewitness, and he's 4 years old. What we potentially have from the mother is corroboration of circumstances surrounding his story. She reportedly smells something unusual and observes movement in the fence exactly where her son pointed toward. But she never sees what caused either one. That's an important distinction at this point, but stick with us. If we simply tell you that the mom and the son encountered the cowman at the fence, we've already strengthened the evidence beyond what the account basically says. Tim says he saw it. His mother said she smelled it and smelled something and saw the wire moving. Those are not the same observations. But according to the story, Tim's mother was unsettled enough by what happened that she brought him inside and kept him there for the rest of the day. Again, that doesn't establish what caused the events, but it does tell us that Baker's account portrays her as taking the situation seriously long before John ever came home. And now here's where things were going to get a little bit more interesting. Because all the while this was happening around the house, the family's 12-year-old son, John Jr., was coming home from a friend's house a few miles away. He hadn't been with Tim when he saw the cowman. According to the account, he didn't know what his younger brother had even reported. But when he got home, he had a story of his own. John Jr. said somebody had followed him through the woods. He never actually saw who or whatever it was. Instead, he reported hearing something moving through the woods alongside the road as he walked home. He described heavy footsteps and the sound of large sticks breaking. Well, something walking through the woods and large sticks breaking. What does that sound like? But based on what he heard, he believed it had to be a very big man. That sounds, the sounds reportedly continued until he reached the family's driveway, where the woods ended near the same field where Tim had reported his cowman. At that point, the footsteps stopped. They didn't follow him out into the clearing. Now we've got something worth investigating. It's not proof of the creature. It's not proof of Bigfoot. But we have two different children reporting unusual events in pretty much the same area on the same afternoon. And according to the account, neither child's experience depended on the other one's story. That's the point here. Where if I'm John, I'm probably going outside to have a look. And that's exactly what the account said he did. So, Robbie, how much evidentiary weight would you give this now? Based on what the 12-year-old has experienced, what the mother smelled, and what the 4-year-old saw.
Well, if you take each account independently, you take the 4-year-olds and look at it for what it is. Even though he's 4 years old, he still had a sighting. Then take his sighting, set it aside, so it was never reported. He didn't say anything to his mom. Mom goes outside. She looks up, sees the fence shaking, and has that smell that we all know is associated with these creatures. That in itself is an encounter. And you take the older child coming home by himself, has a completely different type of encounter that we've heard many people say, have had, including us, have had the exact same type of encounter. You take all three of those separately from each other, and all three of those incidents have been reported many times by thousands and thousands and thousands of people of those actual types of encounters. But then you tie them all together that they all happened to the same family, same area, same afternoon. To me, that strengthens all three. You take any of them separately by themselves, and they're decent encounters. We've talked about encounters that are far less credible than any one of those three by themselves.
Well, if any of these had been reported to BFRO, Tim's would be a Class A.
Class A.
The brother of John Jr. would be a Class B, and the mother's would be a Class C.
Yeah. So, like I said, in and of themselves, those are all three really good sightings, which that's the kind of stuff that you and I look for when we,
Dude, we've done full investigations on less.
Exactly. That's my point. But when you, like I said, if you take them in and of themselves individually, each one of them is a credible encounter that we would go investigate. As you said, we've investigated on much less than that. So, but then you tie all three of them together, that they all happen on the same afternoon, same area, around the same time frame. That, and independent of each other, they weren't playing off of each other. Each one of them's, encounters basically were their own encounters. It just, to me, in my mind, and in my investigative mind, that corroborates all three accounts, makes it one big encounter that just meshes together.
Absolutely. So let me ask you a question, Robbie, and folks in the chat, y'all chime in on this too. Robbie, how old were you when you had your sighting? You were what? I think you said 8?
8 or 9, somewhere around there, yeah.
Okay. Well, Tim was 4. Based on your account, what you saw looking out the window and thinking about, again, this kid being 4 instead of 8, how credible do you give the word cowman? How realistic was a 4-year-old going, that's a cowman? How much do you think that
a 4-year-old saying a bear fed me berries?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think him coming up with cowman was really how he wrapped his mind around it.
Yeah, and like you said, Bigfoot term had only been around for 3 years at that time, 2 or 3 years.
Exactly. So he didn't know what he was seeing.
Well, and case in point with me, just like there was no internet back then. It wasn't like he could get online and say, "Oh, again, pull it up and see a picture of it on the Googles." Oh, that wasn't a cowman, it was Bigfoot. I mean, it's the same thing. I mean, instead of cowman or something like that, I said monster.
Exactly.
Because I was into watching werewolf movies and things like that. So obviously that's the first thought that popped in my mind. This kid worked on or lived on a ranch, and he saw a lot of big cows. That's his mind reverted to what he knew. Just like the boy in North Carolina, they said he loved bears. That's what his mind reverted to, and that's the connection that his mind made. The connection my mind made was monster. The connection this kid's mind made was cowman. I mean, it's not a stretch to me. I mean, I think it's a credible sighting from where we're at right at this particular moment.
Exactly. And I think the mother smelling it, even though she didn't see anything, I think that's a good corroboration of what he saw. But just out of curiosity, that wet dog rotten garbage smell, what else could explain that smell that would have been stuck on a barbed wire fence? Horses don't smell like that. Cows don't smell like that. Bears might smell musky, but that's not what they described it as.
In my experience and from what I've talked to people and what I've actually smelled, we've smelled at the same time together. At the time that we were having activity, there's not many things. It's just like that old question. Well, what does marijuana smell like? Smell like marijuana.
Yeah, it really doesn't smell
What
like
does,
anything else.
exactly. What does Bigfoot smell like? It smells like Bigfoot. It smells like rotten meat and wet dog.
That seems to
And
be a common description.
we both smelled it. That is to me, that's one of the best descriptors that you can come, because that's really what it smells like.
Now we toss in John Jr., a completely separate report of something following through the woods. I think just on what we're taking on, I think that really strengthens the case.
And look what Rodney said, take into consideration where it happened. It happened in Washington. That's a freaking
Rural,
hotbed.
very rural Washington.
And that is a hotbed.
Oh, absolutely. We all know there's thousands upon thousands of sightings in the Washington, Oregon, Pacific Northwest area.
Yeah. It's probably the highest concentration in the country, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, there may be more sightings in places like Georgia and Florida, but back then, that was the hotbed.
Exactly. And Northern California, where the Jerry Cruz incident was. But I think it's very important, to note that all of that happened the same area in the same afternoon. And folks, this is just the opening part of this. There's a lot more to come, so keep that in mind. So at this stage of the investigation, do we have evidence of an unknown creature, or simply several unused observations that haven't been explained? Me personally, because of all three of them experienced something else, at this point, I'm willing to give this story quite a bit of credibility. What about you, Robbie?
Absolutely. 100%. I think from where we stand right now, without getting into the rest of it, the rest of the stuff that we've got to break down, I think it's a very credible. If you just had one or the other, you could say, okay, decent story, decent. But like I said, when you bring all three of them together and tie them together with that common thread of, they're independent of each other. They're not based on one sighting is not based on the other one. I think it ties it together really nicely.
Okay. Now this story was taken in roughly 1960. Okay. How many stories have you and I personally heard, not just read online, but how many stories have we personally heard where someone talked about being paced? And there's no way that kid would have known what that was. People walking down a trail, people walking down an old gravel road, somebody walking through the woods and hearing something pacing them in the woods. And that's exactly what he heard.
It's happened to us. We've had it actually happen to us.
Yeah, it has happened to us a couple of times, a few times.
Yeah.
But when you take each individual portion of this, again, this happened 3 years after the phrase Bigfoot was even coined. So these people had no idea. Like you said, there wasn't no Google or internet to look that stuff on. Now, they probably never even heard the word Bigfoot.
Yeah.
So they're describing behaviors that have been described hundreds of times since then. That's one of the things I find most compelling.
And here's that word. It's consistent.
It is consistent. So...
And I think their stories are consistent with each other's independently, because
there's
no
contradictory statements, not a one. Now that's where we're going to leave Exhibit B, because the next decision John reportedly made gives us our first claim of actual physical evidence. He armed himself. He took his 12-year-old son back outside, and he walked directly toward the fence where Tim said the cowman had been tangled. According to the account, something was waiting there for them. Not the cowman itself, but something caught in the wire. We're going to have to taking a commercial break in just a few minutes, so I don't want to jump into the next segment. Thanks, Kevin.
Ask you
we got about 5 minutes until we can stop. So before we make the actual pause for the commercial break, anything else that strikes you about this just based on this case so far, Robbie, not the rest of the evidence that we're about to present? Anything strike you particular about this so far?
Well, and we kind of already talked about the fact that he called it the Cowman. So he said it was big and hairy like the cows, and it smelled like the cows and all that stuff. To me, that says that he was an observant little fella, and that he was using his head to try to reason out what he saw based on things that he already knew, and he was making those comparative matches based on what he knew in life. So, to me, it's not like he's making stuff up, because if you're making stuff up, you're not going to use something that's realistic. I don't think anyway. I don't think he would have said, it was big and hairy like the cows and it smelled like them, if he was completely making something up. I mean, I think it would have been a lot more fantastical than what he actually said. So
Roxanne,
that kind of strikes me.
At this point, there's no nothing that was said about sounds yet.
So I just think it lends to his credibility even more that he's comparing it to known factors versus making some kind of outlandish.
And for those of you who would like to watch a dramatic retelling of this story, there was a movie made about this story, although they didn't call it the Cowman of Copalis Beach. There was a movie made back in 2015 or 2016. I know Robbie's seen it. He'd probably have to look it up to know, but it's a pretty good Bigfoot film. Fairly low budget. The acting wasn't awesome, but it is a fairly accurate retelling of this story. So if you want to watch this movie to kind of get visuals in your head, you want to go back and watch it later tonight, exactly why it's Something in the Woods. Why it called it out before I had a chance to say it. It's called Something in the Woods, and it is a fairly good retelling of this story. So you guys get a chance to watch that. I think you can watch it for free on Tubi. I think I watched it on Amazon. If you got Amazon Prime, I think you could watch it for free too. At least there you'll watch it without commercials. But it's a pretty good movie. I mean, I'd watch it again. Robbie, have you seen it?
It sounds familiar. I'm pretty sure I have. I'd have to look at the thumbnail, but you know me. I've seen so many of them. Sometimes they kind of run together.
Yeah, you're generally my go-to guy for movie trivia.
I'm sure that I probably have, because if it's a Bigfoot, werewolf, vampire, zombie movie, I've probably seen it.
Absolutely. So we're going to stop here because we're coming up on 5 minutes before the hour, and we've got to take a short commercial break to pay the bills. When we come back, we're going to follow John out to the fence and take a close look at what he found caught in the barbed wire fence. Because this is where the Cowman story moves beyond strange observations and gives us its first claim of actual physical evidence. But while we're gone, think about where you are with this case right now. So far, we've given you a 4-year-old who says he saw something, a mother who didn't see it but reportedly smelled something unusual and watched the fence still shaking, and a 12-year-old boy who says something big followed him through the woods. That's interesting, but none of it really establishes what any of those events were. When we come back, we're going to find out whether the evidence at the fence changes anything. I'm D.A. Roberts. This is the Nightmare Hunters podcast, and we're investigating Open Case Files number 3 with us tonight. So don't go anywhere. We will be right back. So here we go.
Hey everybody, this is Kerry Pocket Doc Davis from Dark Angel Medical, and you are listening to DA Ex Machina with DA Roberts. You may recognize me or some of my products from Dark Angel Medical in some of the Apex Predator, Lakeview Man, and Wild Hunt books, and you can get those products at www.darkangelmedical.com, along with training classes on how to use those products and save a life. Shoot us an email at info@darkangelmedical.com and be the difference.
The new book, How to Research a Haunted House by paranormal investigator Margie Kay and professional researcher Violet Wisdom is now available from Unex Media. This one-of-a-kind book explains how to do research on a house with uncommon methods and resources used by historic home researchers, and how to determine who may be doing the haunting and why. How to Research a Haunted House can be used by homeowners, renters, investors, and it should be in the library of all professional paranormal investigators. Get this unique book at unexmedia.com or amazon.com. That's unexmedia.com or amazon.com. 2026 is off to a great start, and it's almost time. With many exciting predictions and the recent emphasis on a potential major planetary event occurring in April, it promises to be a super transformational month. And we couldn't be more excited to be in Hawaii during this shift to integrate new frequencies. Folks, this will be a once-in-a-lifetime experience. April the 20th through the 24th, 2026, join us in Kona, Hawaii for Journey to Truth's very first vacation conference retreat. Enjoy 9 presenters over 5 days with ocean adventures with dolphins and whales and sacred sites and so much more. Experience Hawaii like never before. You will enjoy 5 days on the Big Island, so don't wait. Start planning your trip today at journeytotruth.online. That's journeytotruth.online. The paranormal field is changing, and now, more than ever, it's time for professionals to lead the way. Join the Oz Professional Paranormal Investigators Association, a global network of serious investigators dedicated to raising the standard of real paranormal research. Access professional certifications, advanced training, and courses exploring true investigation, psychic phenomena. If you're a real paranormal investigator, be a part of the group defining the future. Join today. Visit ozinstitute.org. That's ozinstitute.org. In a world where monsters still walk the earth, one author dares to face them. From the brutal cryptid horror of the Apex Predator series to the Ozark legends that stalk the night in Lakeview, Man. From the elite warriors of codename Wild Hunt to the relentless investigations of the Nightmare Hunter and the frontier terror of Dark Frontiers. When the Dead Rise, the Ragnarok Rising saga unleashes pure zombie apocalypse fury. And across the stars, war rages in the Lost Legion and Man's Marauders. And in the realm of myth and steel, the world of Vanguard calls to those born for legend. Cryptids, zombies, sci-fi warfare, epic fantasy. This is the universe of D.A. Roberts. If you are fascinated by the Sasquatch, Dogman, the Mothman, and the unexplained, this is the event you won't want to miss. Featuring special guest speakers, D.A. Roberts, Scott Nelson, and Margie Kay. And guiding your experience throughout the day, MC Race Hobbs. Enjoy vendors and exhibits, Bigfoot call contests, costume contests, games and interactive events, and much more. Join us Saturday, September the 12th in Kansas City, Missouri for a full day dedicated to the world of cryptids and the paranormal. Register now at ozinstitute.org. That's ozinstitute.org.
And folks, we are back. And just so you guys know, Yes, I am speaking at that last conference there. Tickets are still available. It's going to be a great time. I'll be speaking at 2 different blocks. I'm doing a 1-hour segment on Bigfoot and another on the history of Dogman. So hopefully you see you guys there. Like I said, tickets are still available. Margie K, one of the other speakers and also the host of the show itself, is probably going to be joining us next Wednesday. Waiting to hear back for sure, but she wants to come on, talk about her own paranormal and UFO research, and talk about the convention. And we might actually be giving away some tickets. So check out that. And if you guys are going to be anywhere near Lebanon, Missouri, I know it's kind of a wide spot in the road, but Lebanon, Missouri, over this coming weekend, Friday and Saturday, and both my wife Annette and I will be at the Lebanon Garage Sale and Marketplace at the Cowman Civic Center in Lebanon, Missouri, from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. Friday and Saturday both. We'll have Annette's handmade jewelry and lots of books. So if you're, like I said, if you're anywhere near the area and want to swing by, we'd love to see you. So without further ado, we're going to jump right back into Exhibit C. And Robbie, you want to jump into the middle of that for us?
Sure. Exhibit C, the evidence on the fence, hair tissue and damaged strand of barbed wire. All right, welcome back, everybody. So before the break, we'd gotten to the point where John reportedly decided that he'd heard enough stories for one evening and wanted to go see for himself whether there was actually anything unusual around the property. According to Baker's account, John strapped on a 357 and took his 12-year-old son, John Jr., outside with him. We think the details tell us something of John's state of mind. You know, he'd been listening to this, and he was to the point where he's like, okay, I got to go figure out what's going on. So he apparently wasn't convinced that some enormous creature was roaming around his property, because if he genuinely believed that at this point, taking his 12-year-old son along would be a questionable decision. What he seems to have believed was something had happened, though. His family was frightened, and he wanted to figure out what it was. So they started at the most obvious place, which was the fence. They walked out in the field and began following the fence line near the location where 4-year-old Tim had reportedly seen the Cowman when he had become entangled earlier that afternoon. And according to the account, they found something, a large clump of reddish brown hair that was tangled on the top strand of the barbed wire. Now we're finally dealing with something different from what we've had so far, because up until this point, everything in this case had been testimonial. Tim says he saw something, his mother had smelled something, and saw the fence moving, and John Jr. says he heard something following him through the woods. Hair caught on the fence is potentially physical evidence. So according to Baker's account, John tried pulling the hair free, but found it was tangled badly enough that he eventually had to take his buck knife out and cut it away from the wire. He described the hair as more than a foot long, coarse, stringy, and reddish brown. More interestingly, though, he reportedly believed there was no small amount of flesh or tissue matted into the clump. The top strand of the barbed wire had also been pulled loose from one of the fence posts, and that's potentially significant. But we're going to put the brakes on that right there, because this is exactly where a compelling story can get ahead of the investigation. Finding hair on the barbed wire fence doesn't establish Bigfoot. Finding tissue attached to that hair doesn't establish Bigfoot. Finding a damaged fence doesn't establish Bigfoot. What those things could potentially establish is that an animal became caught in the fence. And if we're investigating this at this time, that clump of hair would immediately become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. We'd want to photograph it exactly where it was found before anybody touched it. We'd want to photograph the damaged wire and the surrounding ground, measure the height of the strand, document how it was attached to the post, and look carefully for blood, additional hair, skin, footprints, broken vegetation, or anything else showing the direction the animal approached and the direction it left. Then we would preserve the hair, because if there really was tissue attached to it, that's where this case could potentially stop being a story. That's where the biological material matters. Today, depending on the condition and the provenance of the sample, like that, there are analytical techniques that could potentially tell us quite a bit about its origin. Even before modern DNA analysis, microscopic examination of hair can sometimes help distinguish among a broad animal group based on characteristics of the shaft, the cuticle, the medulla, and the pigmentation. Unfortunately, none of that happened here, at least not according to the surviving account that we've been able to trace. And there's something else about John's report or reported action that we find particularly interesting. He apparently didn't immediately look at the hair and decide he'd found something unknown. According to Baker, John thought it looked somewhat like hair from a horse's mane or tail. And, we kind of actually like that detail. If we're evaluating this strictly as a narrative, that's not the reaction he would necessarily expect from somebody that's trying to manufacture a Bigfoot story, which, that's something that really stands out to me because, why are you going to say, well, it looks like horsehair if you're trying to, that don't sit right. That dog don't hunt, right, DA? So the dramatic version would have John instantly recognizing the mysterious primate hair and announcing that nothing on earth could have produced it. Instead, he reportedly considered it a perfectly ordinary animal. So he looks for tracks. The problem is that the area on the other side of the fence was reportedly solid grass, and John said he couldn't find any hoof prints or any other tracks that would explain what had been caught there.
Now, as a tracker, how would that affect your ability to track?
Well, as a tracker, I would probably be looking for. He probably was not looking for, like I've showed you, the grass being broke over and matted down and things like that. He was probably just looking for specific. Now, I don't know the guy. I'm not saying he was or wasn't a tracker. I'm just saying, based on what it says right here, it doesn't appear that he was at least a trained tracker because he wasn't looking for things like that. Me, I'm going to be looking for. I might not see an actual footprint, but there will still be signs and evidence that something was there, especially if they've seen where something was tangled up in the fence bad enough to rip a clump of hair out that had a skin attached to it and rip, a strand of barbed wire off the top fence post. Because those things aren't usually put in. I mean, if you're keeping cattle and horses in there, those things have to be attached pretty good. I mean, most of those fence post nails that are those little U-shaped nails are about that big. So they're usually dug pretty deep in that wood.
They don't come out very easy.
Yeah, they're not going to come out easy. So again, I would probably be looking for a little bit different type of evidence than he was probably looking for. And the fact that he didn't really believe that it was some kind of big creature.
Like we said, the phrase Bigfoot had only been coined 3 years before.
Right.
Sure, the Salish in that area had known about Sasquatch and what they called the hairy man for decades, generations going back. So the thought of a big, hairy, bipedal creature walking through the woods was not new to them, but the phrase Bigfoot was.
I think he went out there with a preconceived notion that a horse or a cow was caught up in that thing or was caught up in that fence, and that's where his mind went. Oh, this was like horsehair. There was a horse caught up in this.
Well,
so,
look, did your dad and your uncle immediately believe you when you said monster?
No.
There you go.
That's what I'm saying. He had a preconceived notion in his head, and that in itself shows me that he was not out there looking to fabricate anything. He went out there expecting to find something known. So where was I at? Okay. If we're evaluating this story as a narrative that's not the reaction we would necessarily expect from somebody trying to manufacture a Bigfoot story. And I think we've already kind of jumped ahead and discussed a little bit of this. The dramatic version would have been he instantly recognized it as a mysterious primate and announcing that nothing on earth could have produced it. Instead, he reportedly considers it to be a normal animal, and he looks for tracks. The problem is that the area was okay. I was already way past that. I'm sorry.
You're good.
Again, that doesn't eliminate a horse or another known animal. Absence of an obvious track is an evidence that something supernatural or undiscovered was standing there. And then we kind of already plowed this ground, so to speak. Ground conditions matter. Grass doesn't always preserve impressions well, and it doesn't, depending on the time of day, the amount of moisture on the grass and in the air, all that affects it. And they were relying on John's reported ability to recognize whatever sign that might have been present, which, I already kind of alluded to that with, we don't know if he was just, somebody who'd been in the woods hunting and is used to looking at like deer sign and things like that, or if he was a tracker that has gone through some kind of,
allegedly he was an experienced woodsman.
And that's good, but not all experienced woodsmen are trackers either. And
fair point.
You know me, I'm not tooting my own horn, but that class that I went through taught me more than I thought, kind of like you've always said, you thought you knew some stuff till I showed you some of the stuff that I'd learned. It's a whole
15 minutes
world.
You blew my knowledge out of the water.
But that's the same thing that happened to me when I went to that class. I thought, I know what to look for. It's footprint. I mean, how complicated could it be? It's really complicated once you start for the first time, but once you understand, it's not that complicated. But that's the whole thing of it. Somebody who thinks they might know what they're looking for might not really know what they're looking for. So if he's out there with a preconceived notion that he's looking for, cow or horse hooves, and he doesn't see anything that looks like that, he may have seen something and just didn't realize he saw it.
Exactly. Wasn't even looking for anything else.
Right.
Kind of like we've talked about when people go investigating, you kind of got to keep your head on a swivel. If you're out looking for Bigfoot, it doesn't mean you're not going to run into a dog, man.
Exactly. So, but there's another question that we have. Where did the hair go? According to Baker's later account, after asking his father about the incident, his father said John apparently never mentioned the sample again, and Baker's father never asked what had become of it. That hurts, because not because losing evidence proves the story's false, but because this may have been the single best opportunity in the entire Cowman case to leave us with something independently testable. And we get that stuff all the time. Every time we don't photograph or cast a track, and things happen. Sometimes you get excited. Sometimes you get caught up. Sometimes you're not even thinking about that. You think you got horsehair in your hand. Things happen. So imagine how different this investigation would be tonight if the sample still existed with a documented chain of custody. We wouldn't have to ask what you think the hair belonged to, because we could test it, and we would probably already know. And that's an important lesson that goes well beyond this particular case. And I think I've already kind of alluded to this. If any of you ever encountered something you genuinely can't explain and physical materials left behind, don't immediately stuff it in your pocket. Pass it around to everybody in the neighborhood, or throw it in a plastic sandwich bag and forget about it. Document where it is. Photograph it before moving it. Record measurements and environmental conditions. Minimize handling. Preserve the context as carefully as you preserve the sample itself. Because without provenance, even genuinely unusual material can lose much of its evidentiary value. And that is standard evidence procedure. I mean, that goes for, the stuff we're talking about tonight, and goes for the cases that DA and I have both worked as police officers. Because if the evidence gets destroyed, degraded, contaminated, it's no good. That's no good in criminal cases and no good in cryptid cases. So now, in fairness to John, we're talking about an incident allegedly occurring in the mid-1960s. He wasn't conducting a modern cryptozoological investigation, and according to the story, he didn't even know yet that he was detailing, or what he was detailing with any was particularly extraordinary. He was a father checking on something that had frightened his children, and that matters to me because he was in a whole different headspace than what DA and I are when we go out looking for things like this. So we don't fault him for failing to preserve evidence, or for investigators 60 years in the future, but we do have to account for what what that means today. The hair's evidence within this narrative. It's not evidence that's available to us, and that's a very important distinction. If we had that evidence, we'd be asking all new questions than what we're asking right now. There's one more thing that we want you to remember, though, before we leave that fence. Tim had reportedly said the cowman was stuck there. His mother reportedly saw that same wire moving afterwards. Later, John reportedly found long hair tangled in that wire, and discovered that the strand had been pulled loose from the post. If those three observations were documented independently at a time, we'd call that very interesting convergence of evidence. But they weren't. All three ultimately reach us through the same source chain that we've already discussed. That's why this case keeps pulling us in two directions. Within the story, the pieces fit together remarkably well. The problem is proving that the pieces existed outside the story. And, I kind of think that is kind of the crux of this story altogether is, like we've said, there's a lot of things that make this story, very plausible, in my opinion. I'm sure in yours as well. But there's still those little obstacles, those little roadblocks that you run into when you're driving down that road. And it's like, oh yeah, this looks good. But this, and I think that's the main point of the night is trying to get past those roadblocks, or if you can't get past them.
Right. So you, Robbie, and everybody in the chat, do you think the detail of them finding the hair strengthens Tim's claim that something was caught in the fence?
Absolutely.
I think it confirms that he saw something in the fence.
Yeah. Still don't know what he saw, but there was something caught there. If that is to be believed that he found hair, which there again, there's nothing to corroborate that other than him saying, yeah, I found some hair. But then that takes you back on that other switchback saying, well, he's not saying this to try to garner any fame, because he said, I thought it was horsehair.
So now that you said horsehair, what known animals in coastal Washington could possibly leave long reddish brown hair? He said some of them were like a foot long. What known animal in that area could leave that?
Well, obviously the only thing that I can think of in that area that would leave hair like that, if we're saying other than Bigfoot, if that's what we're looking, the only logical explanation is a horse from its mane or its tail.
Yeah, because nothing else. No bear fur doesn't get that long. Wolf fur doesn't get that long. So for that to be reddish brown and almost a foot long, the only known animal that I could think of would be a horse.
Yeah.
Now that's not saying this is a horse. That's just the only known animal we can say.
Did I miss it, or was this like the top strand, or did they say it was
top
the top
strand? Yeah, top
okay,
strand. Top strand was
okay.
pulled loose.
So throw that in there. Not only what known animal could leave that, but what known animal would leave it that high?
Tall enough to leave it on the top strand.
Yeah.
So again, horse's mane could catch it.
Horse tail. So yeah.
So what about the claim that there was flesh attached to the end of the hair?
Well, I mean, I've been around. I mean, I'm not, Jed was infantry. He was, he wasn't cavalry, so he hadn't been around horses. Yeah. But I've been around horses long enough to know that usually when they lose a strand of hair on the fence, there's not any flesh attached to it.
Yeah. It would be pretty tough to pull out a wad of roots from a horse's hair because it tends to break.
Yep.
Now, but that's not saying it couldn't happen. I'm just saying that's usually what happens. So I think John initially thinking it was horsehair makes his reaction more believable. It makes a big difference, because this wasn't somebody. Well, even with the case, if this case was just simply what was reported by the guy Baker, the fact that he didn't immediately go, "Yep, that's Sasquatch hair," that to me is an important detail, because these people weren't out there looking for Bigfoot. They were out there trying to figure out what their 4-year-old saw.
Yeah. And like I said, that you can actually throw that in just like I did the other 3, and you can actually take that one independently and say, okay, he goes out, somebody tells him that something was messing with his fence. He goes out to inspect his fence line, finds that top strand loose, and finds a clump of hair on it. That's, same thing. We've heard stories of that too. That's another consistent, thing that we've heard reported, them losing strands of hair, stepping over a barbed wire fence.
And another thing I fall back to on that is just how freaking hard it is to pull one of those strands loose. Yeah. If you've ever built fence, which I have, if you've ever built fence, those things don't go in easy. You put those things in there because you want it, so if cattle lean up against it or push against it, it's not just going to pop loose and let them straight out. Those things are nailed in there hard, and you don't want them coming out.
That's why, if anybody's ever put fence in, I can't remember what the tool's called, but you know what tool I'm talking about. It's got that big claw on the end of it that you got to put it inside that little nail and pry it up, and then take it's got the little jaws on it that you grab a hold of after you pry it out with a big hook. You got to put those jaws in it and yank it out. They don't come out easy.
Hillary says, "Oh, I left plenty of long blonde hair stuck on fences when I was a wee lass. I remember leaving the crotch of a couple pairs of blue jeans on a barbed wire fence."
Yeah. Done that a time or two.
Lone Queen says, "You're going to pull some skin off of your hair that long tangled up. Makes me think it isn't horse or cow, as they are coarse enough to pull away versus pulling out skin." Yep, that's kind of verification of what we were saying. So, what about the absence of visible hoof prints? Do you think that weakens the horse explanation, or do you think that goes to show it probably wasn't a horse in the first place?
Yeah, I kind of go back to what I said earlier. He may have seen something, just didn't realize that he was seeing it. He's already thinking horse or cow, so he's looking for a specific type of impression, and he doesn't see that impression, and everything else just kind of fades away.
Bone Queen says, "In other words, I think the tangled hair is finer than horse or cow, which explains being tangled so badly." I would agree. You will sometimes find, knots and stuff in horses' manes. I've been around horses my whole life. But they generally brush out pretty easy. Very rarely do you have to cut clumps out. But, so this is for all of y'all. Again, I want you guys to keep these questions in mind. How much evidentiary value, so how much weight does the hair have when the sample itself apparently no longer exists? Because it's a consistent detail in the story, no matter which source I found. So how much weight do you think the hair gives the story, Robbie?
Well, I mean, I guess it's like 6 1, half dozen other. It's a good indicator. It's a good thing, but you can't put too much stock in it because we don't have it.
Right.
So
now, one thing, the last question I want to leave you guys with before we jump on forward is most importantly here: are we accumulating independent corroboration, or are we still accumulating details from just one source? That's a question I want you guys to keep in mind as we move forward. So John, he could have stopped right there. He could have found something caught on the fence, he had his family safe inside, and darkness was beginning to settle over the property. So, but instead, according to the account, he handed that clump of hair to his son, climbed through the fence, and headed toward the woods to see if he could figure out what had left it behind. And before long, both John and his son reportedly realized they weren't the only things moving through those trees. And that's where we start with the next exhibit, Into the Woods, the first reported face-to-face encounter. All right, folks, pay attention now, because this is where the Cowman story changes considerably. Up until now, nobody other than the 4-year-old Tim has actually claimed to have seen the creature. His mother reportedly smelled something and saw the fence moving. John Jr. heard something following him through the woods, and John found that reddish-brown hair caught in the barbed wire. That's plenty enough information to get our attention, but it's still just a collection of observations that could possibly have ordinary explanations. But according to Baker's account, that changed when John and his 12-year-old son, John Jr., climbed through the fence and went into the woods. The tree line was reportedly only about 10 feet beyond the fence, and they entered along a small game trail that deer regularly used. It was somewhere around 8 o'clock in the evening, so there was still a little bit of daylight left outside the dark timber, but underneath the canopy, it was already becoming fairly dark. As they continued down the trail, John reportedly began smelling the same odor his wife had described earlier, something resembling rotten garbage mixed with wet dog. He also developed that uncomfortable feeling most of us who spent time in the woods probably recognize, whether there's anything actually behind it or not. He felt like he was being watched. There's another detail. How many times have we heard that detail reported in other encounters?
Many.
So eventually, John decided they'd gone far enough. He told his son they should turn around and get back to the house before it became completely dark. And according to the account, John Jr. really didn't need any convincing. But that's when they heard the footsteps. They were coming from somewhere off to their left, moving through the woods alongside them. When John and his son stopped walking, the footsteps reportedly stopped as well. When they started moving again, the sounds resumed. Now let me put that slide up real quick. Yeah, that's the one. There we go. Okay. Now, we want you to put yourself in John's position for a minute, because this next decision is unusual enough that we think it's worth considering rather than just skipping over it. Instead of keeping his son beside him and heading directly for the house, John reportedly whispered to John Jr. that when he reached the count of 3, the boy was supposed to run like hell for the house. He counted 1, 2, 3, and then he shoved his son forward toward the house, drew a .357 Magnum, and turned around, then headed directly toward whatever it was that was been following him. Now, we're not going to pretend that was the decision everybody would make, because it ain't. Personally, if I've got one of my sons with me at about age 12, and something unknown was following us through the woods, getting him safely inside would be pretty high on my priority list. Then I'd come back out there. But Baker describes John as a large, capable man who was accustomed to the woods, and at this point, John apparently believed he might be dealing with a person rather than an animal. Let me take that slide down now. So he thought he was dealing with a person. His working theory was reportedly that some vagrant might be camping in the woods, watching nearby homes, and possibly looking for an opportunity to rob them. He was armed with a large caliber handgun and apparently felt capable of confronting whoever was out there. So John pushed through the ferns and the heavy underbrush toward the sound. As he moved closer, whatever was ahead of him reportedly began moving away, and then it stopped. John thought he could see movement near a large tree, almost as though somebody was trying to hide behind it. He raised his handgun and yelled for whoever was out there to step out. For a moment, nothing happened. Then John caught movement off to his right. So right there, it sounds like there might be 2 of them.
Yeah.
According to the account, his first impression was that he was looking at an enormous bear. The vegetation was dense enough that he couldn't see the entire animal, only portions of a large, dark body moving quietly through the brush on all 4s, roughly 15 feet away. And again, we've talked about Bigfoot using all 4s locomotion, especially when they're moving quietly. And again, notice where John's mind goes. He didn't immediately think Bigfoot. He didn't think Cowman. He immediately thought bear. That's at least the second time in the story where John initially reaches for a conventional explanation. He thought the hair might have come from a horse, and now he's looking at something large and dark in the Washington woods, and he assumes he's seeing a bear. But then, According to Baker's account, John saw something that changed his mind. A long, hairy arm came out of the vegetation, and at the end of that arm, John reportedly what he described as a human-like hand. It reached around a small alder tree, roughly 4 inches in diameter, gripping it somewhere around 5 feet off the ground. Using that tree for leverage, the animal pulled itself upright. John estimated that once it was standing, it was well over 7 feet tall and extraordinarily broad through the chest. Because of the fading light and the heavy vegetation, he said he couldn't make out much facial detail. Although he reportedly believed the eyes appeared red and thought he could see teeth as though the animal were pulling its lips back. What does that sound like? So I want to stop on the eyes for just a moment, because this is exactly the kind of detail that gets exaggerated when cryptid stories get retold. The account says John thought the eyes seemed to glow a deep red. It doesn't necessarily mean we're talking about self-luminous glowing red eyes. There's a considerable difference between eye shine, tapetum lucidum, where available light reflects from the structures within an animal's eye, and eyes actually producing their own light. If John's description was accurate, we want to know exactly what the light source was available, where John was standing in relation to it, and whether what he described could have been just reflected light. Unfortunately, we don't have that information. So we're going to leave it exactly where the account leaves it. John reported what appeared to him to be deep red eyes. What happened next is considerably harder to explain conventionally if the account is accurate, which at this point I kind of believe it is. The creature reportedly remained upright only briefly before lunging forward and pushing back against the alder tree it had been holding. The tree snapped. This wasn't a twig. It wasn't a little sapling that John could easily kick over. It was over 4 inches in diameter, and the creature broke it with enough force that the tree crashed sideways and became hung in the surrounding branches. Then the creature took off. John described it moving through the undergrowth with incredible speed, producing tremendous noise as it forced its way through the vegetation. Suddenly, John realized something that scared him far more than seeing the creature itself. It was moving directly toward the clearing, the same clearing where he'd just sent his son. John ran back toward the game trail, trying to reach the field before whatever he'd encountered could get there. He could hear it crashing through the brush alongside him as both of them moved toward the tree line. John reached the clearing and saw his son, John Jr., waiting just inside the fenced-in field. He screamed at his son to run for the house. Then, according to the account, the creature burst out of the woods approximately 50 feet away. It crossed the roughly 10-foot opening between the woods and the fence in 2 strides, stepped over the fence, and entered the field running parallel to John Jr. This is the moment where the Cowman story goes from strange to, well, potentially terrifying. Because according to John's account, the creature began angling toward his son. John couldn't immediately shoot because the boy and the house were in his line of fire. So he climbed over the fence and ran after them, yelling for his son to run faster. But he could see that the creature was closing the distance rapidly. So John fired 1 shot into the ground next to him, apparently hoping the gunshot would frighten it away. According to the story, though, it didn't. The creature only accelerated. John Jr. screamed, and then something hit him. John reportedly saw the creature lower its shoulder as it reached the boy, and John Jr. was thrown roughly 10 feet through the air before hitting the ground and rolling to a stop. Now here's a detail we find fascinating. John Jr. never saw what hit him. According to the account, he'd been so focused on running toward the house that he never got a clear look at what was behind him. He later described something large and black colliding with him and what felt like a huge paw striking him around the backside. He reportedly asked his father whether it had been a bear. Meanwhile, the creature continued running rather than stopping to attack him. Once John finally had a clear line of fire, he stopped and dumped the rest of the cylinder. He fired the remaining 5 rounds from his revolver at the running animal. But he believed he didn't hit it. The creature never stumbled, never cried out, and never even reacted to the gunfire. It crossed the fence again and vanished back into the woods. John reached his son and found him frightened but apparently uninjured. He got him back up on his feet, and the 2 of them ran for the house. Now, I want to stop here for a second because if we're evaluating the Cowman account just on its own terms, this changes the case dramatically. We're no longer dealing with ambiguous noises. We're no longer dealing with a smell, and we're no longer dealing with hair caught in a fence. Now we have a reported observation from close range by an adult woodsman who initially believed he was looking at a bear, followed by behavior he apparently couldn't reconcile. We also have something else. A second person was physically involved in the encounter. Here's the catch. John Jr. apparently never saw the creature clearly. So once again, the story gives us something tantalizingly close to corroboration without quite giving us independent corroboration of the most extraordinary claim. John says he saw a huge, upright, hairy creature strike his son. John Jr. says something large and black struck him. Those two statements are compatible, but they're not identical. And that distinction does matter. So, Robbie, what do you make of John initially identifying the animal as a bear before reportedly seeing the arm and the hand?
I mean, that's par for the course. I mean, how many people, even now, see something and automatically, it's a bear. It's a bear.
Right.
You know, people have been so conditioned that anything big and dark colored that they see in the woods, they automatically say bear or think bear.
Right. Now that he's described the behavior, what it did, do you think that could have been a black bear moving through the dense vegetation? Or do you think there's no way that was a black bear?
I'm not going to say that it could not have been a bear. I'm going to say it's very unlikely that it was a bear.
Now, had that been a bear, that bear would have mauled that kid. It wouldn't have just knocked him flying.
And that's where I was going with that. So is it possible that it was a bear? Yes. Is it likely? No, because bears don't usually just tackle people for fun and run off the other way.
Unless they're carrying a picnic basket.
Yeah. And I didn't hear anything about John Jr. carrying a picnic basket.
Yeah, there was nothing in the story about that. So he estimated it to be over 7 feet tall. How much confidence should we place in that since it was, fading light and heavy undergrowth?
I mean, he put as much confidence in it as any of his other statements. I mean, he hasn't been, overselling anything so far. And, I mean,
I think if anything, he probably lowballed it.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. Is it, can you say it was 100% accurate estimation because of the conditions? No, but, he was probably making a safe guess, safe assumption.
Right, because he couldn't fathom anything even bigger. Black bears don't get that big.
No.
So here's a critical question. This is for everybody listening. I want you to keep this question in mind. Robbie, imagine a 4-inch in diameter tree. Could you break it?
No.
A tree roughly the diameter of a softball. You think anybody listening in the chat tonight, could you break a tree that big around with your bare hands?
After I hit it with my boarding axe
a few times,
maybe.
So I don't think any one of us, heck, I don't even know if what's his name? Eddie
Brian Shaw or Eddie Hall.
Yeah, Eddie Hall. I don't think Eddie Hall could break a 4-inch diameter tree with his bare hands. Not a live one. A dead one, maybe. But one still alive and sticking out of the ground and snap it off at 5 feet off the ground.
Well, I would put Brian, because Brian Shaw's got way more grip strength than Eddie does, and Brian's 6'8". I wouldn't even think Brian could do it.
I don't think the mountain could do it. So, what about the report that it went from 4 legs to 2 legs and then back to 4?
That's consistent with stuff we've heard before.
Yeah, absolutely.
And way earlier than the internet and the Googles, where people could just get that. where did he get that from? If he didn't see it, that's not like that was a behavior that was widely reported in the 60s that I know of anyway.
Not that I'm aware of either. So
you got somebody roughly, what, 40 years ish before the internet explosion of everybody that puts these. I mean, his behavior that he's witnessing and describing stacks up with stuff that we hear now. And you know, it's like we always talk about, of every major nation on every continent and every civilization has stories of this thing that are roughly the same, but yet they had no contact with each other and had no way of knowing that, you know, halfway across the world, the same people were describing the same thing. They had no way of knowing it. So you got to throw that in there and throw that into consideration of, you know, it wasn't like he was reading this off a Reddit post and saying, yeah, that's what it was doing.
So why do you think it collided with the kid and kept running?
That I don't know.
Yeah, that's a detail that sticks out for me.
The only other time that I can think of is when we read that story, and wasn't that in Washington where the hunter got
sent him flying. It was in Washington.
Maybe that's, I don't know. Maybe that's a trait that those Washington Bigfoot do. I don't know.
Me personally, I think it was intent to show him what it could have done.
It's a possibility.
I think it was more of a threat than an actual attack, because it certainly could have done a lot more damage.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a step above a bluff charge, obviously.
Yeah, because it made contact. Threw the kid 10 feet in the air. The kid's lucky he didn't break anything.
Yeah. Well, had he been standing still, he probably would have been hurt worse. But if he was already moving forward when it hit him, now, I mean, he could still gotten injured very badly just hitting the ground, but that probably, him moving forward and having that forward momentum is probably what helped him absorb that.
Hillary says, did his running trigger a chase response? I don't think it did, because he said when he emerged from the trees, his son was standing on the other side of the fence. He wasn't running.
Well, I think what she meant is when he screamed run,
when he took off.
When the kid took off, is that what triggered?
Yeah, okay, I can see that. Don Donaldson says to show it could have got him, but it decided not to. Yeah, I think all of those are very, very possible.
I mean, we can speculate the reasons all day long, but the only thing that knows why it did that was the thing that did that. And like I said, that's the only two times that I can, in all the accounts that I've ever read, that's the only two times I can remember something like that actually being reported. Now, maybe it's happened a lot more and just hadn't been reported, or whoever it got done to didn't make it out to report it. Who knows? Mm-hmm. But that's the only two that I can think of in my memory that we've talked about that's happened.
I think it's significant that John shot at it. Whether he hit it or not is irrelevant. I think it's significant that he shot at it, because what happened in Ape Canyon when they shot at one?
Very true.
Hillary says, are any of the witnesses still around? Hillary, we don't even have the real names of the witnesses, so I couldn't tell you. If the youngest one, if Tim was still alive, that would put him,
if he was 4
years older than me. Yeah,
if he was 4 in 1960.
He's born in 56, so he'd be my sister's age. Mundock says, was the creature counting coup? That's another good possibility. So maybe the most importantly, If you were investigating this incident the next morning, what would you look to find in the field, in those woods, if this encounter had happened exactly as described? What would you look for?
Well, obviously, if it was running full out like that, full tilt boogie, as Darrell Waltrip would say, then it probably displaced some timber.
Displaced some timber and clearly left tracks.
Yeah. So that's a place that I would be asking John Sr., okay, where did it come out of the woods? And
I'd also be looking for blood or any sign that he hit it.
Yeah. Well, and obviously where it came out of the woods is roughly where he shot at it. So if you can find where he hit the ground, where the bullet hit the ground, then you can work your way around and pretty much find if it blasted out of the woods like that, then it would have left some kind of trace.
Exactly. So here's an interesting question. Don Donaldson says, why did it run the way his son went to start with? Remember when we said he thought he saw it and then he heard movement off to his right? What if there was a young one in there he was trying to get it away from? What if it was deliberately trying to get him away from its mate, its young one, its something?
Well, remember what I told you happened to me and Johnny? When that one paced us way past the normal spot.
Mm-hmm.
And then as we think it happened, slipped and fell down the hill. And as we were walking towards it, we hear all that, the ruckus that started back behind us. And we turn around and look the other way. That's a possibility too.
Yeah, absolutely. So, folks, that last question we just talked about, what would you look for the next morning? That's where we're going next. Because John and his family made it back inside the house, but according to the Cowman story, what he'd encountered simply didn't disappear into the forest. Later that night, something began calling from the woods, and by morning, the family would reportedly find evidence suggesting that something had come all the way up to the house, including one gigantic footprint and muddy fingerprints just outside the 4-year-old boy's bedroom window. Robbie, you want to take us into the next segment?
Exhibit E, the night at the house. The calls, the footprints, and Tim's window. By the time John and his son reached the house, this family had reportedly gone from dealing with a strange story told by a 4-year-old to something considerably more serious. John believed he'd seen a large, upright, hair-covered creature at close range. He'd watched it run towards his son. Something had physically knocked John Jr. off his feet, and John had fired all 6 rounds from his .357 before the animal disappeared back in the woods. If the account is accurate, we don't think anybody in that house was getting much sleep. According to Baker's telling, John explained to his wife what had happened and began taking steps to secure the family. This is also where we have to remind ourselves that we're dealing with a rural family in Washington during the 1960s. Their response wasn't necessarily going to look like the response of somebody living in a subdivision today. John was reportedly accustomed to firearms, accustomed to the woods, and apparently believed that whatever he'd encountered represented a potential threat to his family. Then sometime later that evening, they began hearing something outside. The sound reportedly came from the direction of the woods and was described as a long, powerful vocalization unlike anything the family had recognized. The account portrays it as loud enough to carry across the property and disturbing enough that nobody was eager to go outside and investigate. Now, this is one of those places we have to be careful with language. Calling something a Bigfoot howl doesn't tell us anything. That's an interpretation. What we have is a report of that the family heard an unusually loud vocalization coming from the woods and didn't recognize the source. Without a recording, we can't compare it with elk, coyotes, cougars, owls, domestic animals, or any other wildlife capable of producing sounds that can be remarkably strange if you don't know what you're hearing. And there's another problem. We're once again dealing with something that exists only inside the account. We don't have audio. We don't have independent neighbors saying, yeah, I heard it too. At least not in the material that we've been able to establish. So we note it, but we don't give it more evidentiary weight than it deserves. But what reportedly happened around the house is more interesting. At some point during the night, the family believed the creature had approached the residence. Baker's account describes noises around the property and activity close enough to the home that John remained concerned about the safety of everyone inside. And then there was Tim. According to the story, the 4-year-old was sleeping in a bedroom with a window accessible from outside, and the creature reportedly appeared just there. Now, think about the progression we've been given. Tim is supposedly the first person to see the cowman at the fence. Later that same day, John encounters what he believes is a creature in those same woods. The animal then reportedly runs toward John Jr. And now, according to the story, it has come to the house and positions itself outside the bedroom window of his youngest child. That's where this stops feeling like a random wildlife encounter and begins taking on a much more disturbing character. However, how many times have we heard the modern Bigfoot encounters where they were watching children? Right here. The account says Tim became aware of something outside his window, and the creature was reportedly making sounds towards him. Depending on the version and the retelling you're familiar with, you may have heard considerably more elaborate descriptions of that interaction. We're deliberately not going beyond what we can trace with reasonable confidence, because this is exactly where a frightening story can acquire details every time somebody retells it. What matters for the investigation in this central claim: something large was reportedly outside Tim's bedroom window, and the following morning the family went outside to look, and this is where we reach another one of those moments where we find ourselves wishing somebody had treated the property like a crime scene. According to the account, they discovered an enormous footprint near the house. The print was described as approximately 18 inches long and human-like in overall shape. Now, 18 inches gets our attention, but an 18-inch footprint isn't automatically an 18-inch Bigfoot footprint. Excuse me. We want measurements beyond length. We want width at the heel, across the 4 foot, toe dimensions, stride length, depth, substrate, conditions, photographs, and a scale. Photographs of the entire trackway rather than a single impression, and preferably a cast. Because one isolated impression can fool you. A partial track can overlap another track. Mud can collapse. An animal can step into an existing impression. Water can enlarge edges. Human activity can distort a print. Without documentation, an 18-inch measurement sounds impressive, but it doesn't allow us to evaluate morphology. And once again, that's the problem. We don't have the footprint. We have a report of the footprint. The account also describes muddy marks or impressions around Tim's window that were interpreted as hand or finger marks. Those marks really existed in conjunction with a large footprint beneath the window. That would certainly be worth documenting. But we're in exactly the same evidentiary position. No preserved casts that we can examine, no original photograph, and we've been able to authenticate, no measurement sheet, and no independent investigator's report.
Hey, Robbie, hate to do this to you, but we got to stop for a break. Save your spot. We'll pick up right there after we come back. But we got to stop right there because we're coming up on 5 minutes before the hour. So we got to take a short commercial break. But before we go, though, think about where this investigation stands right now, because we've covered a lot of ground since the last break. According to the account, we've now got a 4-year-old who reportedly sees something strange near a barbed wire fence, a mother who smells something foul and sees the fence moving, another child who believes something large followed him through the woods, hair, possible tissue, an adult witness who claims close range encounter with a large upright creature, and a physical collision, gunfire, nighttime vocalizations, and an enormous footprint. And something apparently is coming close enough to the house to leave marks outside the child's bedroom window. All of these events happen. If all these events happen as reported, this is an extraordinary case. We want to remember the question we've been asking all night. How much of it can we establish? Because when we come back, another adult enters the story and potentially gives us exactly what we've been looking for. So hang on. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back, and hopefully you guys will stick with us. Get those questions ready, because we are about to kick this off. Be right back.
If you are fascinated by the Sasquatch, Dogman, the Mothman, and the unexplained, this is the event you won't want to miss. Featuring special guest speakers D.A. Roberts, Scott Nelson, and Margie K. And guiding your experience throughout the day, MC Race Hobbs. Enjoy vendors and exhibits, Bigfoot call contests, costume contests, games and interactive events, and much more. Join us Saturday, September the 12th in Kansas City, Missouri for a full day dedicated to the world of cryptids and the paranormal. Register now at ozinstitute.org. That's ozinstitute.org.
Hey everybody, this is Kerry Pocket Doc Davis from Dark Angel Medical, and you are listening to DA Ex Machina with D.A. Roberts. You may recognize me or some of my products from Dark Angel Medical in some of the Apex Predator, Lakeview Man, and Wild Hunt books, and you can get those products at www.darkangelmedical.com, along with training classes on how to use those products and save a life. Shoot us an email at info@darkangelmedical.com and be the difference.
In a world where monsters still walk the earth, one author dares to face them. From the brutal cryptid horror of the Apex Predator series to the Ozark legends that stalk the night in Lakeview Man, from the elite warriors of codename Wild Hunt to the relentless investigations of the Nightmare Hunter and the frontier terror of Dark Frontiers. When the dead rise, the Ragnarok Rising saga unleashes pure zombie apocalypse fury. And across the stars, war rages in the Lost Legion and Man's Marauders. And in the realm of myth and steel, the world of Vanguard calls to those born for legend. Cryptids, zombies, sci-fi warfare, epic fantasy. This is the universe of D.A. Roberts. The new book, How to Research a Haunted House by paranormal investigator Margie K. and professional researcher Violet Wisdom, is now available from Unex Media. This one-of-a-kind book explains how to do research on a house with uncommon methods and resources used by historic home researchers, and how to determine who may be doing the haunting and why. How to Research a Haunted House can be used by homeowners, renters, investors, and it should be in the library of all professional paranormal investigators. Get this unique book at unexmedia.com or amazon.com. That's unexmedia.com or amazon.com. 2026 is off to a great start, and it's almost time. With many exciting predictions and the recent emphasis on a potential major planetary event occurring in April, it promises to be a super transformational month. And we couldn't be more excited to be in Hawaii during this shift to integrate new frequencies. Folks, this will be a once-in-a-lifetime experience. April the 20th through the 24th, 2026. Join us in Kona, Hawaii for Journey to Truth's very first vacation conference retreat. Enjoy 9 presenters over 5 days with ocean adventures with dolphins and whales and sacred sites and so much more. Experience Hawaii like never before. You will enjoy 5 days on the Big Island, so don't wait. Start planning your trip today at journeytotruth.online. That's journeytotruth.online. The paranormal field is changing, and now, more than ever, it's time for professionals to lead the way. Join the Oz Professional Paranormal Investigators Association, a global network of serious investigators dedicated to raising the standard of real paranormal research. Access professional certifications, advanced training, and courses exploring true investigation, psychic phenomena. If you're a real paranormal investigator, be a part of the group defining the future. Join today. Visit ozinstitute.org. That's ozinstitute.org.
And we are back. Robbie, I'm going to let you just jump straight right back in there where you were at. I am going to have to step away for just a minute, so I will be right back.
All right. So what we're accumulating is a remarkable amount of claimed physical evidence that somehow never becomes independently testable evidence. And we want to be very careful here because that statement can sound more accusatory than we intend it to be. We're talking about events supposedly occurring decades before anybody imagined people would someday be discussing them on a podcast and examining them frame by frame on YouTube. A frightened family isn't necessarily thinking about a chain of custody or evidentiary preservation. If something had just been outside of my window with my 4-year-old son, I probably wouldn't be like, hold on a minute. Let me go get the camera. Let me go get the casting material. Let me get something photographic by scale. So I get it from that standpoint. My primary focus would be on protecting my kids and my family. So the failure to preserve evidence doesn't prove that the evidence never existed. But 60 years later, it's absolutely the limits of what we can do with it. There's another question here that bothers us more than the footprint. Why Tim? But then again, how many Bigfoot stories involve small children? Like I said, going back to myself, I can identify with this story. If we're dealing with an ordinary animal that wandered on the property, then the sequence may simply be a coincidence. The creatures get caught on the fence, move through the woods, encounters John, runs across the field, and later approaches the house. But within the story, Tim keeps appearing at critical points. Tim reportedly sees it first, then the creature is reportedly caught near the window where Tim sees it. Later, something comes to Tim's bedroom window. If these events happen exactly as described, we have to at least consider whether the animal was deliberately interested in the child. We're not saying that's what happened. We're saying that's a question an investigator would have to ask. And apparently John began to ask that question too, because after the events around the house, this stopped being a matter of curiosity. According to the account, John decided he needed help figuring out what was living in the woods. And that's where the other adult in the story enters.
So thus far, if this is to be taken as the story was told, how much evidentiary value do you give the reported nighttime vocalizations? I mean, without a recording or independent witnesses, we can only take their word for it. But
right,
how many other times have we taken reports of vocalizations?
A lot. But and I would say that you got to give it at least a fair amount of credit, because this is not some people that were just in the woods camping in an area that they had no idea about. This is a family, and they lived in this area, obviously for a decent amount of time. So you would think, especially as many times as they've established that John was an established woodsman, you would think that they would know the vocalizations of the animals in their area.
You'd think,
so
yeah.
If it was enough that it unnerved them like that, I think it's safe to infer that it was something that they'd never heard before.
So, considering where they're at in coastal Washington, what would you think would make an unusual howl like that?
I mean, you always got the usual suspects: coyotes, wolves, mountain lions, cougars, whatever they call them in that area, pumas.
but he would be familiar with those.
Well, that's what I'm saying. That's where everybody's going to go automatically, is something like that. But like I said earlier, you would think with him living in that area, him being a staff, I'm going to make the assumption, make the leap, and this is just making this leap. I'm going to say because he had guns, he was an avid woodsman, he was a hunter. So
more than likely, because people that lived out in the woods like that tended to fill their freezers with deer meat and things like that.
So I'm gonna infer that he knew the vocalizations of animals in that area. Especially if he lived there all of his life, or at least most of his adult life.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that.
So
Robbie, as a tracker, well, as a cop, how significant would having, photographs or a cast or exact measurements of that 18-inch cast, that 18-inch footprint be? How significant would that be?
Oh, it'd be very significant. Like we said, it's not, absence of that is not
right. What is it? Dance always says, absence of proof is not proof of absence.
Yeah.
Right.
And she's right. That's we know that from law enforcement. Just because it's not something that we can prove yet doesn't mean it didn't happen. So I mean, I think it's significant, but there again, as I said earlier, it's not a nail in the coffin that they don't have it. It would be nice,
but without that documentation, should we still give any weight to the quote unquote weight? No pun intended. Should we give any weight to the track?
Well, I mean, how many times have we heard just on the show that we've read in the chats that people have seen tracks and like things happen?
Yeah.
It's not.
Well, here's the phrase that pays, Robbie. Based on the preponderance of evidence, I would say that the existence of the track just helps solidify the rest of the story.
Yeah, and as we said, it would be nice to have a cast of that track, a photograph, something to show scale. But I've seen tracks that I couldn't get a picture of because for whatever reason I either didn't have a camera, didn't have my phone, didn't have I couldn't get to my phone or whatever. I mean, you've done the same thing. You and I have been together and seen stuff that we didn't get to document just because sometimes you just get caught up in the moment. So it's not, like I said, it's not the nail in the coffin, and I hate to keep sounding like a broken record, keep using that, but that's true. It's not, it would be great to have, not just nice. It would have been great to have it, but I don't think not having it weakens the case, I guess is the best way to put it.
So
having it would strengthen it, but not having it doesn't weaken it, in my opinion.
Exactly. So here's where I really want to rely on your tracking experience here, Robbie. You and I both know that, like, for example, a footprint in snow, freezing, melting, refreezing can make the track bigger. Now, this was in bare ground, and they have described it as like a bare human-like impression. What could expand? Okay, let's say somebody had a size 14 foot. That's a pretty good size boot.
Mm-hmm.
What would expand that to 18 inches? What could expand it to 18 inches?
Well, like you said, if it's a double step, like somebody stepped and then moved forward and the flat part of their foot erased the original toe impressions, and that can do it. Weather, if it had rained and kind of the over the night, the ground maybe dried up a little bit, and that can, the ground shrinking and contracting and expanding can cause things to you've seen it when we've looked at tracks that are underwater. They look bigger than they are sometimes. Sometimes they look smaller depending on how the light's reflecting off the water surface. without knowing all the conditions of the substrate and where the track was found and what the weather conditions were, it's hard to say exactly what could do that. It could have done that, but I mean, there's all kinds of factors. But without actually looking at the track, which, like we said, this is the hitch and the giddy up, so to speak. Without having something to look at, it's hard to say, if it was a pristine track or if it was something that, had some kind of factor that made it look bigger than it actually was. But yeah, to answer your question, there are things that absolutely can make things appear different sizes. I've told you about tracks in the sand. If the wind's blowing, heavily, it can shift track pattern. I mean, if it's blowing across just one section of tracks, you can have a straight trackway, and all of a sudden in the middle of that trackway, you can have 3 or 4 prints that are shifted to the right or the left of that straight trackway, just because the wind actually moves the tracks themselves, and it looks like, straight line off to the, stuff like that happens. So there's all kinds of things that can affect a track. But again, when you're out there looking at it, you have being in the moment and actually looking at it and seeing the conditions, knowing what's going on. That is what helps you. Without having all that, it's hard to say, yeah, this actually is what caused, or this is this, or this is that, because it's just, there's so many factors that can go into it.
Another thing I find really compelling about this story is the way it focused on the 4-year-old. How many times have we heard stories where it focused on small children or a woman home alone?
A lot. Probably a lot more.
This happened long before any of those stories were ever on the internet.
Yep.
So that's another detail I find really interesting. And are you noticing the same problem I am? Why does this case repeatedly produce potentially extraordinary physical evidence that never seems to survive for independent examination? That's a question we do need to ask about this. What happened to the evidence?
In my personal opinion, I think we've kind of already sort of answered that. John was in, I'm going to protect my family mode. He wasn't in cryptid investigation mode.
Exactly. This was not a cryptid investigation. I don't think, other than like John Bindernagel, I don't think anybody was investigating this back in 1960.
No, probably not. Maybe, what's the other guy? The British guy.
I know who you're talking about, but I can't think of his name.
Yeah, he was real big around the same time Bindernagel was really coming into prominence too. Mm-hmm. He's been on all kinds of. He was on In Search of, like, what's that guy's name?
Yeah, it's going to drive me nuts too. I can't think of it.
But yeah, other than people like that, there wasn't anybody.
Right.
He was actually one of the first ones, I think, that went and investigated Bluff Creek after Patterson and Gimlin.
Yeah. So do you want to finish this out and lead us into the next segment?
I think we already, we were at the, I thought we were anyway.
Well, there's a little bit right there after the questions.
Okay. Did not say, all I saw was commercial break, so I rolled over past that. All right, at this point, if I were John, I wouldn't be particularly interested in proving Bigfoot existed. I'd want to know exactly what was coming onto my property and whether my family was safe. And we've kind of already established that. But according to the account, John apparently reached the same conclusion. So he brought in another man, and for the first time since the investigation began, we potentially have somebody outside the immediate family entering the case. That's important because if we're trying to establish whether the Cowman encounter actually happened, an independent witness could change everything. The question is whether he does. Now we're on to Exhibit F.
So Exhibit F is the outside witness. This is where Patrick enters the investigation. And again, We don't know if Patrick's his real name. It probably isn't, because I don't think they used anybody's real names in this. So we left where we left off is what we think is one of the most important developments in this entire case, because up until this point, almost everything we've presented has remained inside the family, and that really does matter. Family members can corroborate one another, but from an investigative standpoint, somebody outside that family potentially gives us something much stronger. If another person walks onto that property without having experienced everything John and his family experienced, examines the scene, and independently observes something unusual, suddenly we've got another source of information. Let me bring up that image. Oops. According to Baker's account, that's exactly why John called a co-worker. We're going to refer to him by the pseudonym they used in the story, Patrick. Patrick wasn't just another logger, and that's kind of important to know that John was a logger. Patrick wasn't just another logger. Baker's account describes him as a former Washington State police officer who was no longer with the agency, reportedly because of problems involving alcohol. John nevertheless considered him a good worker and apparently believed Patrick had enough investigative experience to be useful. The account also makes it clear that Patrick was skeptical when John first explained what had happened. He didn't immediately accept the cowman story, but he apparently believed John was genuinely frightened and agreed to help him look around. And now that combination interests us. As former law enforcement officer, and Robbie's still currently one, I was skeptical of the story, but willing to examine the scene potentially exactly as the kind of person we want to. A person who's skeptical of the story is exactly who we want looking at this. Look at this from an investigator's point of view. We don't want somebody that immediately goes Bigfoot. Patrick goes in skeptically. So John sends his wife and kids away for the day. And when Patrick arrives, the two men arm up and begin searching around the house. Before they even reach the woods, they reportedly discover something significant. At the rear of the house was an outside water faucet that leaked enough to keep a patch of exposed ground beneath it muddy. According to the account, sitting right in the middle of that mud was an enormous footprint. John described it as looking like a bare human foot, except that it was at least 18 inches long and unusually wide. Now, nearby were 4 straight grooves, each reported about 8 inches long, almost as though someone had dragged 4 fingers through the mud. Now, if you're remembering what we said before the break, this is where the story starts tying itself together. Tim had reportedly said the cowman spent part of the night outside his window. John Jr. had heard something against the house. Now, John and Patrick reportedly find a large footprint and strange finger-like marks in the mud near the residence. According to the account, they continued around the house toward Tim's bedroom, and that's where they discovered marks on the exterior wall beneath the window that appeared consistent with something having been there. Now, if we're investigating this in real time, that's potentially important physical evidence. But here's the question we've been waiting all night to ask. What did Patrick actually see? Because Patrick is supposed to be our outside witness. And this is where we have to be extremely careful not to give him testimony that the source doesn't actually cite. The account tells us Patrick was there. It tells us he participated in the search. It tells us John and Patrick circled the house together and examined what was reportedly found. But the detailed description of that footprint comes to us through John's account, as relayed by Baker's father and ultimately written by Baker. We don't have a statement from Patrick. We don't have Patrick telling us, yes, I saw an 18-inch footprint. We don't have him describing the marks beneath Tim's window. We don't have his measurements. We don't have his photographs. We don't even have his real name. And that's important because it's very easy for us to accidentally turn Patrick into independent corroboration simply because the story says he was standing there. Presence is the same thing as testimony. That's a distinction we want everybody listening tonight to remember. If we're investigating a crime scene and somebody tells us 3 other people saw it, we don't automatically have 4 witnesses. We have 1 person telling me that 3 other people saw it. We don't get those additional witnesses until we actually interview them. And right now, that's exactly where we are with Patrick. He's potentially one of the most important people in this entire case, but he's also somebody we can't independently question. Now, according to the broader Cowman account, John and Patrick didn't stop at the house. They armed themselves and went looking for whatever John believed had been terrorizing his family. And the story continues through additional activity around the property. But we don't want to lose sight of what Patrick represents simply because the narrative is getting exciting. Patrick represents an opportunity. If we could identify this man, find a contemporary statement from him, or locate anything he wrote or told another investigator independently of John, we suddenly have a second evidentiary channel. And that's potentially huge. But without that, Patrick remains inside Baker's narrative. And this is where the Cowman case starts teaching us something about the difference between a detailed story and a documented investigation. A story can contain 10 witnesses. An investigation doesn't necessarily have 10 witnesses until we can establish that those people actually existed, locate what they independently said, and compare their accounts. That's not us being cynical, though, folks. That's basic corroboration, and that's what you do in an investigation. You corroborate the stories. You search for alibis. You search for the truth. Now, there's another person who eventually enters the story, and this one's even more interesting. After the situation reportedly escalated further and the family left the property, John's brother accompanied him back to the house. According to Baker's account, when they arrived, they found the interior of the house extensively damaged. Furniture had been reportedly overturned. A heavy console television had been thrown, and dude, you remember how much those freaking televisions weighed in the early 70s? Oh my God.
Yeah.
It had been thrown. The refrigerator had been thrown over on its side. Food was scattered around the kitchen. The master bedroom had been shredded, and a mirror had been smashed apart. John's brother reportedly took a look at the damage and told him he needed to call the cops. John's response was essentially the problem we've been dealing with all night. What was he supposed to tell him? Bigfoot destroyed his house? But according to the account, John didn't make that call. Instead, he and his brother drove to the mill and told Baker's father what had happened. And now we finally reach the person closest to to our source of the chain. Baker's father reportedly went back to the house himself. So now we've got a second-hand story, not a third-hand story. That's important. Unlike almost everything else we've told you tonight, Baker wasn't merely saying his father heard about the aftermath. According to the story, his father personally went to the property and saw the damage. Baker says his father walked through the house with John, observed the destruction, and even noticed cracks in the ceiling that they'd interpreted as possibly having been caused by something very tall standing upright inside the house. I think that puts it well over 7 feet at that point.
Yeah.
John also reportedly still had the clump of reddish-brown hair, and Baker's father said he personally examined it. Now that gets our attention, because if Baker is accurate recounting what his father told him, we finally moved one step closer to true independent corroboration. Baker's father wasn't there when Tim saw the Cowman. He wasn't there during John's encounter. He wasn't even there when John Jr. was knocked down. And he wasn't there during any of the nighttime activity. But he reportedly saw the aftermath. He saw the damaged house, and he handled the hair. That's considerably more useful to us than somebody simply repeating John's story. But it still doesn't solve the underlying problem. We don't have Baker's father's contemporaneous report. We don't have photographs he took inside the house. We don't have the insurance documentation. We don't have the insurance adjuster's report. We don't have repair invoices. We don't have a police report because, according to the story, the police were never called. And we still don't have the hair. Baker's account even acknowledges that he later asked his father what became of that sample, and his father apparently didn't know because John never mentioned it again. That's frustrating because we're getting tantalizingly close to something independently verifiable. If the house was damaged badly enough that a heavy television and refrigerator were thrown around, windows were broken out, furniture was smashed, and the family ultimately moved away, there should have been a paper trail. The account even claims that the homeowner's insurance adjuster inspected the damage and refused to cover it because the adjuster believed John himself had caused the destruction in a drunken rage. But think about that. If that happened, somebody outside the family saw the house. Probably more than one person. There may have been an insurance claim. There may have been an adjuster's report. There may have been repair records. Heck, there may have even been records associated with the eventual sale of the property. Suddenly, we're not talking about trying to prove an 8-foot creature existed. We're talking about proving whether a house was damaged. And that's a much easier historical question, at least in theory. And yet, based on what we've been able to establish so far, we don't have those records. So where does that leave our outside witness? Patrick reportedly participates in the investigation, but we don't have his testimony. John's brother reportedly sees the destroyed house, but we don't have his testimony. Baker's father reportedly sees the destroyed house, examines the hair, and his recollections, his memory, forms the basis of Baker's story. An insurance adjuster reportedly inspects the damage, but we don't have that report. There's a lot of potential corroboration, but potential corroboration and documented corroboration are not the same thing. And that's exactly why the final exhibit matters. So, do you think Patrick's reported presence strengthens the case, even if we don't have independent statements?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's no different than anything else we've talked about tonight. I mean, there again, we're looking at this through the lens of 2026 and how we would investigate things. But how long has this type of investigation been going on now versus how long it had been going on then? So it's hard for us to judge how we would handle it now versus how they would have done and handled things back then.
Right.
So, when we look at it through our lens, it's a little bit, I don't want to say jaded, but you know what I mean. Right. It's hard. It's easy for us to say, well, yeah, they should have had this, they should have done that, but
they weren't investigating it like we were.
Exactly. That was the point I was getting at.
It was just an animal. They didn't know what it was.
Yeah. So, would you think to do some of the stuff that we're talking about doing? Obviously we would think about it now because that's what we would be investigating it as. Right. But like you said, all they knew was some strange animal was stalking their property, basically.
Right. So, how much weight should we give Baker's father's claim that he personally saw the damaged house and examined the hair? I personally feel that having the son have taken the story directly from the dad, who was an eyewitness, I think that really, really boosts.
Yeah, I mean, you could give it as much weight as anything else we've given tonight.
Yeah, actually, I think it would give it a little bit more weight because it wasn't him telling a story of what his dad told him. It wasn't just that. It was him recording eyewitness details from his father versus story here.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I think that at least as much as we've given everything else, if, like you said, if not more.
Yeah, and then, of course, we got John's brother who also saw it, and an insurance adjuster.
And the thing is, if the adjuster went and looked at it and said, well, you did this on your own in a drunken rage, would there ever even have been a report? Because would he have even filed a report if they weren't going to cover anything?
Right. I mean, maybe not. And our first color television we got in 1973. I remember it because it took 4 men to carry that heavy son of a gun into the house.
Yep.
It was massive. One drunk dude did not throw that across the room.
No.
But, so I really wish we had the missing hair sample or even the cast, but we just don't have that physical evidence. So at this point, how many independent witnesses do you believe we would actually have as opposed to the people Baker says were involved? I mean, if the insurance file was filed, we'd have him. He probably didn't come alone. The report got sent to somebody. I think we've got potential second layer witnesses that the story doesn't even mention.
Yeah.
I would love to know the real names of the family involved and see if we could figure out which insurance company it came from. But finding that, probably no chance of that. Or very, very slim. So that's the question we're carrying into the next exhibit. We've spent most of tonight doing something very deliberately. We've treated the Cowman account as though the events happened. just as they were reported. And we've examined each piece from the inside of the narrative. Now we're going to turn the entire investigation around. We're going to stop asking what the Cowman was. We're going to start asking, what can we actually prove? And when we do that, this case starts to look a little different. Robbie, you want to take us to the next section?
We're in G, right?
Yeah.
Exhibit G, investigating the story. What can we actually establish? All right, this is the point where we're going to change the way we've been looking at it at the Cowman of Copalis Beach, because for most of the tonight we've been deliberately giving the accounts and the benefit, or giving the account the benefit of the doubt. We've walked through the events substantially as they were presented in Baker's story. We've looked at what the witnesses reportedly experienced, and we've tried to evaluate each piece without dismissing it simply because we don't have the original witness sitting right in front of us. Now we want to turn the investigation around. Instead of asking what happened to John and his family, we're going to ask a much more basic question. What can we independently establish actually happened? That's an uncomfortable question with this case, because within the narrative, there's an enormous amount of evidence. There's a child who reportedly sees a creature, another child who hears something following him, a mother who smells something unusual and watches a fence moving, and hair and possible tissue being recovered from that fence. An adult who claims a close range visual encounter, another child who is physically struck, gunfire, vocalizations, a huge footprint, marks around the bedroom window, another adult brought into the property, extensive damage inside the house, the brother who reportedly sees the aftermath, Baker's father who reportedly examines both the damage and the hair, and even an insurance adjuster who supposedly inspects the residence. If we had all that evidence in a room, we'd have one hell of a case. But we don't. What we actually have is an account attributed to S.D. Baker, who says he learned much of the story from his father concerning the events experienced years earlier by a man Baker identifies with the pseudonym John and members of John's family. We also have evidence that the versions of the story circulated within the online Bigfoot community years ago, and that people on the Bigfoot forums remembered an older version and discussions with the person who posted it. That helps us establish that the story has some history behind it, but it doesn't independently establish the events described within it. That's the distinction we want to concentrate on now, because providence and corroboration are related, but they're not the same thing. If we can trace the story back 20 or 30 years, we've established that the story existed 20 or 30 years ago. We haven't necessarily established that the events described in the story happened. So we start looking for kinds of things that we'd expect to find if we're reopening any historical investigation. We want a contemporary documentation, statements from the people involved, photographs, newspaper coverage, law enforcement records, property records connected to the alleged location, insurance documentation, or anything else that will allow us to step outside Baker's narrative and establish portions of the story independently. And based on what we've been able to locate for tonight's investigation, that's where the trail becomes frustratingly thin. We haven't located a contemporary police report connected to the alleged events, although the account itself gives us a possible explanation for that, because John reportedly chose to not call law enforcement. We haven't located a contemporary newspaper report describing a family near Copalis Beach being terrorized by an unknown animal. We haven't found any authenticated photographs of the reported footprint, the damaged fence, the marks around Tim's window, or the destruction inside the house. And we haven't found the hair sample that supposedly contained possible tissue. Most importantly, we haven't located firsthand statements from John, his wife, John Jr., Tim, Patrick, John's brother, or the insurance adjuster. Again, listen carefully to how we're saying that. We're not telling you those things never existed. We're telling you that we haven't been able to locate them. That's a very different statement, and we think researchers sometimes damage their own credibility when they confuse the two. If we haven't found something, the responsible conclusion is that we haven't found it, not nobody ever could. There's also an issue of the pseudonyms, which creates a very practical problem for anybody trying to investigate the case decades later. Protecting witness identities is understandable, especially when you're dealing with a story that could expose a family to ridicule, but anonymity comes at a cost. If we don't know John's real name, we can't easily search local newspapers for him, identify the property, look for insurance claims, locate surviving relatives, establish employment history, or determine whether Patrick really was a former Washington State Patrol officer. In other words, the same anonymity that may have protected the family also makes independent verification extremely difficult. Then there's the physical evidence, and we think this may be the greatest missed opportunity in the entire case. The hair should have been enormously valuable. If Baker's account is accurate, we're not talking about somebody finding a few ambiguous strands on a bush. John reportedly removed a substantial clump of long reddish brown hair from barbed wire, possibly with biological tissue attached. And Baker's father later reportedly handled the same material. If that sample still existed with a reliable provenance, we'd be far more interested in testing it than debating what anybody thought the creature actually looked like. The same applies to the footprint. An 18-inch human-like impression could potentially be extremely interesting if we had photographs, measurements, casts, a trackway showing locomotion. Without those things, however, we have a description of a footprint rather than a footprint we can evaluate. The destruction inside the house creates a different kind of opportunity because that isn't cryptid evidence at all. It's property damage, and property damage potentially leaves ordinary records behind. If an insurance adjuster really inspected the house, there may once have been a claim file describing what the damage and perhaps even photographs documenting the interior. That wouldn't prove that a Sasquatch destroyed the house, but it would independently establish that the destruction Baker described actually existed. And that's important because investigations don't always move forward by proving the extraordinary claim first. Sometimes you build from the outside inward. Can we establish that the family existed? Can we establish that they lived at the reported location? Can we establish the house was damaged? Can we establish that the insurance claim was made? Can we establish that Patrick existed and had the background attributed to him? Can we establish that Baker's father employed John? Every one of those ordinary facts would give us another fixed point from which to evaluate the extraordinary ones. Right now, we don't have enough of those fixed points. That doesn't mean that the Cowman story is a hoax, and we won't emphasize that because we haven't uncovered evidence demonstrating that Baker fabricated the entire account either. We haven't found any confessions where somebody admits making the whole thing up, and we haven't found documentation conclusively showing that the events couldn't have happened. What we have is something considerably less satisfying. We have a detailed story with potentially impressive internal corroboration, but with very, very little independent documentation available from an outside source chain that delivered the story. And there's another trap we want to avoid here. The Cowman account has been repeated for years throughout the Bigfoot and cryptozoology communities. And repetition creates familiarity. Familiarity can eventually create the impression of corroboration, because we remember hearing the story from multiple places and subconsciously begin treating the story from all those different places as separate sources, which DA mentioned earlier. But if a website copied website A copied Baker, website B copied website A podcast used website B, and then another article cites the podcast, we haven't accumulated 4 independent sources. We've created an echo chamber around one source. That's why tracing information backwards matters. We don't want the newest version of the story. We want the oldest version that we can locate, and then we want to know what evidence that version was based upon. In the Cowman case, the trail appears to lead us back toward Baker and the story he says that he received primarily through his father. The recollections of older Bigfoot forums suggest that the account has deeper online roots than many of the modern reports, which is useful when establishing the history of a narrative, but we still eventually arrive at the same wall. We need the original witness, or we need something they left behind. Without either one, there's only so far that we can take this investigation. Now, here's where we think the case becomes more interesting rather than less interesting, because none of these problems necessarily tell us the Cowman encounter didn't happen. What they tell us is with a level of confidence we can reasonably assign to the story has to be different from the level we'd assign to a case with identifiable witnesses, contemporary documentation, preserved physical evidence, and multiple independent statements. That's not debunking, that's weighing the evidence. If tomorrow somebody hands us authenticated photographs from the property, an insurance report documenting the damage, a contemporaneous letter written by one of the family members, or a surviving statement from Patrick that independently describes what he saw, will change the weight and give the evidence case, or change the weight that we give the case. That's what you're supposed to do when new evidence arrives. You don't defend your conclusions, you update them. And that's really the question that we've been building towards all night. When we opened this file, we told you we weren't merely asking whether the Cowman was a Bigfoot. We wanted to know whether we could establish that the encounter itself actually happened. After going through everything that we could find, we think we can establish that the Cowman story has circulated for years and that its surviving source tradition points back toward Baker's account of something his father said happened to one of his employees and that employee's family. What we cannot currently establish to our satisfaction, though, is that the extraordinary events within the story occurred substantially as described. Those are not the same conclusions. We haven't proven the story false. We simply haven't found enough independent evidence to prove it's true. And if the answer feels frustrating, welcome to the investigation. Sometimes the evidence doesn't give you the ending you wanted. It just gives you the ending that you've earned, or that it earned.
Yeah. So, how much does the inability to identify the principal witnesses affect the weight you give the story?
Well, I mean, it affects it a lot. I mean, that's not necessarily a bad thing, not necessarily negative, but it does affect it because, like we said, when you take all the elements of the entire thing, each independent side or independent encounter, they're all fairly credible. They're all, but in saying that, you have to address the elephant in the room, or the 800-pound gorilla, or whatever you want to call it. You have to address the issue that every single one of those accounts, as far as we know, all come from Baker.
Right.
You and I are both authors. We write fiction stories all the time. You got to ask this question: could Baker have made this whole thing up? And if he made it up, that's why everything would tie in so nicely together.
Okay, but
I'm not saying he did, but you have to ask that question.
Yeah, you definitely got to ask that question. But I'm just playing devil's advocate here. Back in the days of Bigfoot forums, making up a story like that didn't get you any kudos, because there were maybe in those days there were maybe 40 people on there. In fact, there was another. I was on Bigfoot forums and another one called Kiamichi Giants, and Kiamichi Giants is where I first heard the Siege at Honobia story.
Yeah,
and so a lot of those stories got circulated on those message boards long before Facebook and any of that. But it wasn't like you could post a story on social media and it go viral because you were
Right.
only posting it for the 20 guys in your chat.
Right. And like I said, I'm not saying that is what happened, but you have to
Yeah, you do have to ask that question.
because that's a very valid point of if he made it up, that's why it's all so coherent.
Right. What do you think about the age of the story? Do you think that the fact that it happened in the early 60s that make it more credible, or do you
No.
think it only makes the story old?
I think based on the way the story is told and the things that happen, I think that gives it a little bit more credibility because simply, the mindset, like I mentioned earlier, the mindset was totally different. There was
Nobody
only
was
a few
looking for the
people.
15 minutes of fame.
Yeah, and
In fact, if they would have been looking for fame, they'd have used the real names.
yeah. So, like I said, you have to ask that question about Baker because I don't know anything about him. I don't know. To me, personally, it doesn't sound like somebody that is writing an extravagant story that's made up to garner fame. Because if it was, I think there would have been a lot more flair added to it, for lack of a better term. I think it was told very matter of factly, and it. Now that's not saying that he couldn't have wrote it that way, but it just feels to me like it was the way it was written out, the way that we presented it here makes it feel like it actually was him listening to what his father was telling him, and it is written out like somebody would having these encounters would relay it.
Right.
It doesn't sound like one of the books that we read. It doesn't sound like it is. There's some fantastical things, obviously, but it doesn't read like a fiction novel.
Right.
I guess.
But if this was a story, if this was a complete fabrication, it certainly rings true. Did I lose you, or did I lose me? Okay, sorry.
I hear you.
I thought I disconnected or something. So what about the extra witnesses? Do you think that adds credibility to the story? Because if this was a work of fiction, why would you go to the extent of creating multiple extra witnesses? You just tell the story.
Well,
say this happened to me or it happened to my dad.
Yeah, and that's kind of the point I was getting at is, to me, if you're gonna add these extra people, number one, I wouldn't have added the insurance adjuster,
Right.
because just for the reasons. Okay, then where's the report?
And if I was trying to give myself more credibility, I would have said he called the cops and the cops either didn't come or came out there and didn't know what to make of it.
Like, I'm just telling what they told me. I don't know why they called the insurance adjuster out there. I don't know. I don't know if they did actually. I'm just, that's just what was told to me. That, to me, that's kind of lends to the credibility, because I don't know why you would. That would kind of weaken, just because of the fact that, okay, that's something that's, like you said, that's something that's kind of easy to look into and check if we had the real names, obviously. That kind of goes back to that. There's all kinds of little twists and turns and pitfalls that kind of can trip you up in this one if you what if it too much.
Now, based solely on what we've talked about tonight, do you think there's enough evidence to conclude that something unusual did happen to that family?
Oh, I think absolutely something unusual happened. Now, what happened? I don't know. I personally, I think we kind of hit the nail on the head earlier. I don't think it was an actual cowman. I think they had a Bigfoot encounter.
I do too.
And that's just what the kid's mind defaulted to, what he knew. For the simple fact that, like what we talked about, there's just so many things. Now, I don't know when he actually, you might have said it earlier, or when he actually put the story out there, but there's just so many things in the story that, so many things that we hear now that in the 1960s was not commonplace.
Right.
So if he wrote this story in the 70s or even the 80s, this stuff still wouldn't have been commonplace.
Right.
It wouldn't be something
like there was a database where you could look at sightings.
Yeah.
It just wasn't.
Oh yeah, they walk on all fours a lot of time. Oh yeah, they
they make this kind of wood knock sound.
Yeah. There's he would have had to, if he did fabricate it, I think it would have had to have been something that, unless he's just that clairvoyant and
right,
knew what people were going to be talking about, in this day and age, to write it that way. I think that, because if he wrote it in, 80s, or probably even, I would say probably even the early 90s, you still wouldn't have known all that stuff.
Right, exactly, because it was pre-internet.
Yeah. And there's so many things that we hear, that we read in that story tonight, that we've actually heard people tell us that they've experienced.
And experienced for ourselves.
Exactly. So like I said, having to play devil's advocate and having to throw that out there, having to ask that question, do I believe he did that? No, but that's something that you have to.
Exactly.
You have to, like we say, you have to examine all the evidence, not just the evidence that you can't pick and choose. Oh, well, I don't want to throw that in there because that'll take me somewhere. Might take me somewhere I don't want to go. I want this to go here. You can't do that. You have to go where the evidence takes you, not where you want the evidence to take you.
Yeah. But folks, bear in mind that right now, the only thing we can confidently say is that this is a remarkably detailed story. We don't have any of the corroborating evidence, even though these details are extremely compelling and they line up with so many other stories. But ask another question I want you guys to ask yourself is, what evidence would you need to change your mind one way or the other, to make you believe, to make you disbelieve? Because this is the case file that we have. So now we're going to do what we promised you at the beginning of tonight's show. We're going to stop presenting evidence. We've put everything together and we've examined tonight on the table. We're going to put it all out there at the same time and tell you where we land. But this time, we don't think one verdict is enough. There are really two questions before you folks, because you are the jury. Do we think the Cowman story is possible? That's question number one. And have we seen enough evidence to conclude that it actually happened? Those questions may sound similar, but after spending tonight inside this case, we don't think they're even remotely the same. Now it's time for the jury deliberation. But before we do, unfortunately, it is coming up on the top of the hour, and we still got quite a bit of material to cover. So, folks, if you will bear with us just a few more minutes, we're going longer tonight than we have in a while. We are about to have to take our third commercial break, which we're usually done after 2. But here we go with the third commercial break, and we will be right back, folks.
The new book, How to Research a Haunted House by paranormal investigator Margie Kay and professional researcher Violet Wisdom, is now available from Unex Media. This one-of-a-kind book explains how to do research on a house with uncommon methods and resources used by historic home researchers, and how to determine who may be doing the haunting and why. How to research a haunted house can be used by homeowners, renters, investors, and it should be in the library of all professional paranormal investigators. Get this unique book at unexmedia.com or amazon.com. That's unexmedia.com or amazon.com. 2026 is off to a great start, and it's almost time. With many exciting predictions and the recent emphasis on a potential major planetary event occurring in April, it promises to be a super transformational month, and we couldn't be more excited to be in Hawaii during this shift to integrate new frequencies. Folks, this will be a once-in-a-lifetime experience. April the 20th through the 24th, 2026, join us in Kona, Hawaii for Journey to Truth's very first vacation conference retreat. Enjoy 9 presenters over 5 days with ocean adventures with dolphins and whales and sacred sites and so much more. Experience Hawaii like never before. You will enjoy 5 days on the Big Island, so don't wait. Start planning your trip today at journeytotruth.online. That's journeytotruth.online. The paranormal field is changing, and now, more than ever, it's time for professionals to lead the way. Join the Oz Professional Paranormal Investigators Association, a global network of serious investigators dedicated to raising the standard of real paranormal research. Access professional certifications, advanced training, and courses exploring true investigation, psychic phenomena. If you're a real paranormal investigator, be a part of the group defining the future. Join today. Visit ozinstitute.org. That's ozinstitute.org.
Hey everybody, this is Kerry Pocket Doc Davis from Dark Angel Medical, and you are listening to DA Ex Machina with DA Roberts. You may recognize me or some of my products from Dark Angel Medical in some of the Apex Predator, Lakeview Man, and Wild Hunt books, and you can get those products at www.darkangelmedical.com, along with training classes on how to use those products and save a life. Shoot us an email at info@darkangelmedical.com and be the difference.
If you are fascinated by the Sasquatch, Dogman, the Mothman, and the unexplained, this is the event you won't want to miss. Featuring special guest speakers, D.A. Roberts, Scott Nelson, and Margie K. And guiding your experience throughout the day, MC Race Hobbs. Enjoy vendors and exhibits, Bigfoot call contests, costume contests, games and interactive events, and much more. Join us Saturday, September the 12th in Kansas City, Missouri for a full day dedicated to the world of cryptids and the paranormal. Register now at ozinstitute.org. That's ozinstitute.org. In a world where monsters still walk the earth, one author dares to face them. From the brutal cryptid horror of the Apex Predator series to the Ozark legends that stalk the night in Lakeview Man. From the elite warriors of codename Wild Hunt to the relentless investigations of the Nightmare Hunter and the frontier terror of Dark Frontiers. When the Dead Rise, the Ragnarok Rising saga unleashes pure zombie apocalypse fury. And across the stars, war rages in the Lost Legion and Man's Marauders. And in the realm of myth and steel, the world of Vanguard calls to those born for legend. Cryptids, zombies, sci-fi warfare, epic fantasy. This is the universe of D.A. Roberts.
And we are back, folks. We are going to jump right back into the middle of this with both feet. So thank you guys for sticking around. We've still got quite a bit of stuff to cover. So weighing the Cowman case. So we've reached a point where we're going to stop adding evidence to the file and start weighing what we've already got. Because if you've been investigating this alongside us tonight, you've probably noticed that the Cowman of Copalis Beach presents us with a very different problem than some of the other cases we've examined. If we evaluate the story strictly from inside the narrative, there's quite a bit here that we find compelling. The events build upon one another in ways that make sense. The people involved don't always immediately leap to extraordinary explanations, and several of the reported observations appear to overlap. Tim says something became caught in the fence. His mother reportedly sees the fence moving and notices the odor. John later finds hair tangled in the wire. John Jr. reports something following independently of his younger brother's experience, and John himself initially considers both a horse and a bear before concluding that neither explanation fits what he's seeing. These details matter to us because they're exactly the kinds of things we look for when we're evaluating a witness account. We're interested in whether somebody begins with a conclusion and forces every observation to fit it, or whether they appear to work through the ordinary explanations before arriving somewhere unusual. Within Baker's telling, John generally does the latter, which is good. We also find that the reported behavior of the family interesting. They aren't portrayed as people trying to hunt Bigfoot or become famous for discovering something extraordinary or trying to film something on TikTok to go viral. They're portrayed as a family becoming increasingly scared by activity around their home. And as the situation gets worse, their attention appears to shift toward protecting the children and eventually leaving the property entirely. Again, that's how the story portrays them. And that qualification matters enormously, because once we step outside the narrative, almost everything that makes the case compelling becomes difficult to verify. And that's why we told you before Exhibit G that we thought we needed 2 verdicts tonight rather than 1. Let me put up this one here. So first question, is the story internally plausible? If we're asking whether the events described in the Cowman account could have happened, we don't see anything that allows us to simply throw the story out. Washington's coastal forests clearly provide a habitat capable of concealing a large animal. People can encounter wildlife unexpectedly. Animals can, and do, become entangled in fences and leave hair behind. Large animals can produce strange vocalizations, damage property, leave tracks, and behave unpredictably when they're frightened, injured, territorial, or get habituated to people. The extraordinary part isn't that any single one of these things could happen. It's the creature John reportedly saw and the way all of those events are connected within the story. If John accurately described a massive hair-covered animal moving on four legs and then standing upright, possessing human-like hands, breaking an alder tree several inches in diameter, chasing his son across a field, and later returning repeatedly to the family home, then we have something that doesn't fit comfortably into any ordinary animal explanation we could give you. But that sentence begins with the most important word in tonight's investigation. And that word is if. Unfortunately, that's where we are. So that gives us question 2. Do we think Baker was lying? We haven't found evidence that gives us a responsible basis for accusing Baker of creating the story. That's important because skepticism sometimes gets lazy. It's easy to encounter a story you can't verify and immediately go, somebody just made that up. That's not an investigation either. That's far into the other side. If we're going to accuse somebody of deliberately creating a hoax, we want evidence supporting that accusation. We haven't found a confession, and I've done Google searches and done deep dives in forums. Nobody has ever come forward either claiming to have been one of these family members or debunking the story. So we haven't found a confession, we haven't found an obvious source from which the story was copied, and we haven't found anything that conclusively demonstrates Baker knowingly invented John or the events attributed to his family. But what we do have is Baker saying his father told him about something that happened to one of his employees years before that. That could be completely true. Baker could have accurately reported exactly what his father told him, and the underlying story could still contain mistakes, exaggerations, misunderstandings, or details that changed over time. That's one of the reasons hearsay becomes increasingly difficult to evaluate as the number of links in the chain grows. So, our verdict, I'm pretty confident I can speak for Robbie on this. Our verdict is that Baker lied. I think he was telling the truth. Our verdict is that we don't have enough independent information to determine how accurately the story reflects the original events. And that leads us to the third question. What's the strongest evidence? This is an unusual one because our answer isn't the footprint, and it isn't even the hair. For me, at least, the potentially strongest piece of evidence is Baker's father. If Baker accurately represented his father's involvement, then his father reportedly knew John personally, employed him, heard the account directly from him, visited the property afterwards, saw extensive damage inside the house, and personally handled the reddish-brown hair John claimed came from the fence. That's potentially significant because Baker's father provides a bridge between the person telling us the story and the family who supposedly experienced it. Problem is that we're still receiving his observations through Baker. If we had a recorded interview with Baker's father, a written statement from him, photographs he took at the property, employment records identifying John, or anything else that could independently connect him to the events, that bridge would be considerably stronger. But as it stands, it's interesting, but it doesn't get us all the way across. And question 4, what's the weakest part of this case? For me at least, that's easy. I'm sure Robbie will agree. It's the missing documentation. Not one missing photograph or one missing report, but the cumulative absence of things that should potentially be available if the story happened substantially as described. The hair's gone. We haven't located authenticated photographs of the footprint. We haven't located photographs of the damaged house. We don't have John's statement. We don't have his wife's statement. We don't have statements from either of the kids. We don't have Patrick's statement. We don't have John's brother's statement. We don't have the insurance adjuster's report. And we don't have a police report, although the story itself tells us why one may never even existed. Any one of those things being missing wouldn't bother us very much in a decades-old case. But taken together, however, they kind of leave us with very little that we can independently test. And that's a problem we can't really get around. So that leads us to the next question. Does the lack of evidence mean it didn't happen? Well, frankly, no. And we want to make that absolutely clear. Absence of evidence is not automatically evidence that something didn't happen, particularly when we're talking about an alleged incident from roughly 60 years ago involving people who apparently had no intention of creating a historical record for future cryptozoologists. Families don't preserve every insurance document forever. Photographs disappear, people die, houses change ownership, memories fade. Physical samples get thrown away because nobody realizes they might someday matter. All of that is completely reasonable. But there's another side to that principle that sometimes gets forgotten. The absence of evidence also doesn't become evident that something did happen. We can't just fill the gaps with belief. All we can do is acknowledge the gaps and adjust our confidence accordingly. So, what would change our minds? This may be the most important question of the entire deliberation because every one of you investigating this, right here along with us, you should know that what evidence would cause you to completely revise your conclusion. For us, well, at least for me, it wouldn't require a preserved piece of the Cowman sitting in somebody's freezer somewhere. Give me something ordinary. Identify John. Show me a piece of documentation that establishes that he actually did work for Baker's father. Or show me the property. Find the insurance claim. Find the photographs of the damaged house. Locate Patrick and verify the background attributed to him. Find an old letter from one of the family members describing the events before the story became part of Bigfoot folklore. Or give us a newspaper clipping mentioning unexplained property damage or unusual animal activity in the area. Any one of those things gives us another independent anchor, gives us several of them, in fact, and our assessment of this case would change substantially. That's what we mean when we talk about following the evidence rather than defending a belief. We don't need the new evidence to agree with us. We need it to tell us something we didn't know yesterday. So, let's get to our verdict. And Robbie, we'll have you jump in here too. After spending tonight reopening the Cowman of Copalis Beach, where do we land? We think there are two answers, at least I do. On the first question, do we think the story describes something that could conceivably have happened? Yes, I do. Robbie?
Yeah, I definitely
Okay.
think something happened.
Okay, so there we go. We concur that we both believe something happened. There are aspects of the account we find genuinely interesting, and if the core witnesses could be identified and their statements independently corroborated, we'd consider this case worth taking very seriously. Hell, I'd consider taking a trip out there. That's not the question in the title of tonight's episode. The question we asked, what was this? Did this encounter actually happen? And based solely on what we've been able to establish, our answer has to be that we just don't know. More specifically, we don't think we currently have enough independent evidence to conclude that the Cowman encounter happened substantially as described. Robbie, do you agree with that?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's not a verdict of false. That's not a verdict of this is a hoax. And it certainly isn't a verdict that people involved were lying. It's an evidentiary verdict. The story may be true. What is that? They call that an offered plea. They don't plead guilty, but they admit there's no.
Null pros.
Yeah, null pros.
Nolo, or nolo contendere.
Yeah.
Is probably what you're thinking more of.
Yeah, in this case,
I plead guilty because I think if it goes to trial, there's enough evidence to convict me, but I'm not saying that I'm guilty.
Right.
Kind of the inverse of that.
But if we'd put this case on trial, we would have to find in the favor of not being true because of the lack of evidence. But that doesn't mean it's not true. The story may be true, or parts of it might be. The original events may have been considerably different from the version that eventually reached the internet. Or the entire thing may have begun as a story that became far more convincing simply because it survived long enough to become familiar. Right now, we can't establish among those possibilities with the confidence we'd need to close the file. And that means the final verdict doesn't belong to us anyway. It belongs to you folks. So the question's for you, for the jury. Do you believe the Cowman encounter happened substantially as the way Baker described it? Which reported detail carries the most weight for you, and why? Which part of the story creates the greatest doubt for you? Do you think Baker's father provides meaningful corroboration, or does the secondhand source chain prevent you from giving his reported observations? Giving him much weight. Does the amount of allegedly lost physical evidence concern you? If you believe something happened, how much of the Cowman narrative do you think reflects the original event? And if you're skeptical, what evidence would cause you to reconsider? Are you comfortable leaving a case unresolved rather than forcing it in either true or false? And finally, if you're sitting on this jury tonight, what would your verdict be? So that's where we land. And now we want to hear where you landed. We've presented the case as fairly as we know how. We've told you what we find compelling. We've told you what bothered us. And we tried very hard not to confuse something we can't verify with something we've proven false. Because we didn't prove any of this false. We just can't verify it. Now, the evidence is yours. It's time for your verdict. Robbie, you want to talk to the jury, the ladies and gentlemen of the jury?
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Get that old Southern lawyer going.
Yeah, the big chicken on Futurama.
Yep. Well, we actually had an old, he's dead now, but he was a good one, John DeYoung. And when he was sitting there, when you go up there for jury selection, he'd turn around and go, "Please swear the juror." That's why he talk like Foghorn Leghorn.
There you go. So Robbie, you're Matlocking this piece. Go for it.
All right. Audience verdict. You be the jury. All right. Like we said, this is your turn. We spent the night walking you through the Cowman of Copalis Beach from two different directions. First, we treated the account substantially as reported and asked what the evidence would look like if these events happened the way Baker described them. Then we turned the investigation around and started asking what portions of the story we could actually establish independently. Those two approaches brought us to very different places, and that's exactly why we chose this case for the open case files. If we stay inside the story, we find quite a bit that's compelling. We have multiple members of the family reportedly experiencing different pieces of the same escalating situation. Physical evidence that appears to connect some of those experiences, and adult witnesses who initially consider conventional explanations. Another adult reportedly brought into the investigation a badly damaged house, and Baker's father allegedly seeing some of the aftermath for himself. If all that happened substantially, as reported, we wouldn't have any trouble calling the Cowman of Copalis Beach one of the most remarkable prolonged Sasquatch encounters we've examined. Problem is that the investigation can't stop with a good story. Once we step outside the narrative, the case becomes much harder to hold on to because nearly every road eventually leads us back to the same source chain. People who we most want to interview are hidden behind pseudonyms or otherwise unidentified. The physical evidence hasn't survived in a form we can examine, and the ordinary records that might independently anchor parts of the story haven't surfaced in the material that we've been able to locate. That's why we couldn't give you a simple true or false verdict. Now, we want yours. If you're watching live, put your verdict in the chat. Don't just give us true or false or undecided. Tell us what you got there. If you're watching the replay, do the same thing in the comments, because the reasoning behind your verdict interests us more than whether or not you just happen to agree with our verdict. And I think, we've shown that DA and I both feel pretty much the same way about this. Maybe you believe John and his family really encountered a Sasquatch near Copalis Beach, and that 60 years of lost records explain why so little independently verifiable evidence remains today, which is certainly a plausible explanation. Or maybe you think something happened, but suspect the story changed as it passed from John to Baker's father and from Baker's father to Baker himself, and eventually through decades of retelling. Also very plausible in itself. Or maybe you think the source problems are simply too substantial to overcome, and you're not willing to accept the encounter without independent corroboration. And again, all very, plausible explanations to get behind, and you can't be faulted for having any one of those conclusions. But there again, you may be exactly where we are tonight, sitting somewhere between those positions and just wanting another piece of evidence before you're willing to move. Any of those verdicts are reasonable, and if you can explain the evidence, and if you can explain how the evidence brought you there, that's the point of an open case file. We're not trying to build a room where everybody agrees with us. We want to build a room where we can look at the same evidence, reach different conclusions, explain how we got there, and remain willing to change those conclusions if somebody brings something better to the table. And that brings us to something we want to ask all of you directly. If you know more about this case than we've been able to uncover, we want to hear from you. If you have an archive copy of the earliest Cowman account and from the old Bigfoot forums, discussions, information that could help establish the identity of one of the people involved, contemporary newspaper coverage, documentation connected with the property, or another source that predates the version we worked from tonight, send it to DA, because we want to know. I'm sure his email will be put up in the chat. Don't send us another modern retelling. Send us a source behind the retelling. That's how we move forward in this investigation. Because the verdict that you're rendering tonight doesn't have to be permanent. Ours isn't either. If better evidence surfaces tomorrow, we want to reopen the case file and follow it. That's what an open case is supposed to be. It's open for a reason. It's not closed. Verdict is not final. So in closing, like I just said, this case remains open. And unlike the others, you can't FOIA this one because we're going to discuss it. So before we get out of here tonight, we want to thank everybody who spent the evening investigating this one with us. These open case files only work if you're willing to participate, question what we're presenting, and challenge our conclusions. When you think if you think we've missed something, and resist the temptation to decide what you believe before you heard the evidence. That's especially important with cryptozoology because this field has spent far too many years trapped between two extremes. One side, you've got people willing to accept almost anything as evidence because it supports something they already believe, those preconceived notions that we talked about. And on the other side, you got people willing to dismiss almost anything because they've already decided the subject itself is so ridiculous. Neither one of those positions interests us very much, though. We don't think believing everything makes you open-minded, and we don't think dismissing everything makes you skeptical. Good investigation lives somewhere in between, where you're willing to entertain an extraordinary possibility while still demanding that the evidence earn your confidence. The Cowman of Copalis Beach is a perfect example of this. We don't know whether John existed under another name. We don't know whether his family experienced the events that Baker described. We don't know whether there was a large unknown animal moving around the property, whether a more conventional event grew into something extraordinary through the years of retelling, or whether the answer lies somewhere in between those possibilities. What we do know is that we haven't found enough evidence to responsibly tell you that we've solved it. And I don't think you'll ever hear us say anything like that because we're always looking for the next bit of evidence. And we're perfectly comfortable saying that too. An investigator who can't say, I don't know, eventually starts inventing their own answers. And that's 100% accurate, whether he realizes that he's doing it or not. And that's that whole line of if you go into an investigation thinking you already know the answer, then the evidence is going to start pointing you towards that answer that you've already got in your head of what the answer is. We'd rather leave a question unanswered than pretend we've earned a conclusion that we haven't. If you've enjoyed tonight's investigation, do us a favor before you head out. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and if you haven't already, share this episode with somebody who enjoys Bigfoot, Sasquatch, cryptozoology, and unexplained encounters, historical mysteries, or evidence-based investigation. If you'd like to help support the work we're doing here, consider becoming a channel member and joining the Nightmare Hunter Nation. Every bit of support helps us keep digging into these cases and bringing them to back to the table for another look. And if this was your first Open Case Files episode with us, go back and check out our previous investigations. I think this is our third open case. Is that right, DA? So go back and check the others and check the rest of our stuff out too. Because the whole idea behind this series, we're going to reopen cases that have become part of cryptid history, strip away as much accumulated folklore as we can, go back toward the original sources, put the available evidence on the table, and then let you decide what you think happened. We're not asking you to believe us, and I don't think we've ever asked you to just believe everything that we say. We've always said, this is our opinion, and we're just speculating on most of the stuff, unless it's stuff that we've actually experienced in the field. We never say, this is how it is. We're just asking you to investigate with us. Tonight, we opened a file on the Cowman of Copalis Beach, and after everything that we've examined, there's still witnesses we can't interview, records that we hadn't found, evidence that may no longer exist, and questions that we honestly just can't answer. Maybe someday something turns up that changes that. But until then, we're not going to close anything just for tonight. But as of tonight, this case remains open. And it's pointed the wrong way. He's D.A. Roberts. I'm Robbie Jed Raines, and this has been the Nightmare Hunters, Cowman of Copalis County, or Copalis Beach. I always wanted to say county after that. It just kind of rolls off your tongue.
It does kind of. Folks, thank you guys for spending your evening with us. Thank you for being part of the Nightmare Hunter Nation. And until we open the next file, stay curious, stay skeptical, follow the evidence wherever it leads you, and always ask better questions. So before we go tonight, there's a few things we always like to talk about at the toward the end of the show. I want you guys to check out the good folks that have been affiliates of the show. Check out you've seen the commercial a few times tonight. Check out Doc's folks over at Dark Angel Medical. Best med kits in the business, and they're HSA and FSA certified. So if you've got a first responder, you can get them covered. Check them out. Get a kit. Save a life, because the life you save might be your own. And Doc's packing birthdays in boxes, and you can use discount code Cryptid20 for 20% off your entire order. Check out the great folks over at Scallywag Tactical. They make awesome blades. I have a crap load of them, and I love every one of them. Fantastic knives. And Robbie got one right there. I don't think I got one. I got one handy. Got the
I got
tried and true.
I got more than one handy.
I've only got the one handy because mostly what's on my desk right now is pew related.
I got that too, but I always got my scallywags close at hand.
Oh, dude, I think I've got 6 handguns here on the desk. I really, yeah. 7. So, check out the good folks at Scallywag Tactical. Use discount code DARoberts10 for 10% off your order. And don't forget to check out the good folks at, let me have to cover up the branding. Oops, there we go. Sigwell Arms. SigwellArms.com. Great group of people, manufacturer of firearms, and they have all the brands you like. They got everything from ammunition to whisper pickles and firearms. So check them out at SigwellArms.com and use discount code Bigfoot5 for 5% off your order. And if you're a first responder or veteran, let them know, and they'll bump that up to 10. So again, check them out. Awesome group of people. And both Robbie and myself and Doc, if he was here, we also have books. And hopefully you guys will check those out because we love storytelling. And we've got a lot of them to sell you, like close to 50, well, I think over 50 between the 3 of us.
Yep.
So check them out. You can find them all in. What's that?
I was about to say, before Doc started writing, me and you together were 42, and we've each put out about 2 or 3 more books since and Doc's got one out. So I'd say we were over 50, or at least at 50.
Yeah, and they're all available in Kindle, print, and in audio form. You can find them all on Amazon.com, or you can find mine on DARoberts.net. So hope you guys will check them all out. I hope you'll enjoy those books and find yourself in a world of stories you can immerse yourselves in. So check all of those out. And at the end of the night, I always want to talk about the 22 a Day Foundation. We lose 22 veterans a day to suicide, and that is 22 too many. So reach out to your friends and family who are first responders or veterans, anybody that's worn a uniform to defend our freedom or defend our homes. Let them know you're thinking about them. Let them know you care, because 22 is entirely too many. Let's get that down to 0 where it needs to be. And you'll see at the end of the credits tonight, you'll see a number you can reach out to if you need help, if you're a veteran. And do reach out. We've all had to do it at one point or another. And we would rather hear your story than read your obituary. And there are people that care.
Toshi wants a book update. When can we expect new books?
Well, I'm going to try to get one done either late this week or early next week. I've got that convention appearance this weekend, but if it's slow, I'll just write while I'm there. I'll take my laptop. So hopefully, if I get everything straightened out, get the covers done, hopefully I'll have something to release in the next week or 2. And then I hope to have several more over the rest of the year.
And I just started chapter 21, about getting close to 60,000 words in the one I'm doing. So hopefully this week or next for my current one. So look for both of us to hopefully have releases coming out the next week or so.
So again, reach out to your friends and family who are first responders or military veterans. Let them know you're thinking about them. Let them know you care, because don't let the hard days win. And that one, "Hey, are you okay?" text might be what keeps somebody off the edge. So reach out to them, invite them out for a drink, come have them over for a barbecue. Let them know you're there for them. So as we wind this down, we end the show with a toast. And something I'm really proud of, and we're going to continue to do it. I'm going to put the toast up on the screen. The toast is from an old Irish drinking song called "The Parting Glass." It's a beautiful song. It's a haunting tune, and it talks about not just saying goodbye to the people at the end of the night, but saying goodbye to the ones we've lost along the way. So when you hear this quote, it'll ring for you. You'll hear it. That's a beautiful song. If you've never heard it, you should go on YouTube, look it up, and listen to it. But the quote says, "But since it fell into my lot that I should rise and you should not, I'll gently rise and softly call. Good night and joy be to you all. Slan Java, and we will see you next week. Good night, everybody."
Plains, the winds are howling, saloon doors swinging, shadows growling. 3 lawmen stand tough as rawhide. Yeah, Doc and DA, nothing can abide. Whiskey shots and poker faces, staring down the darkest spaces in this town where legends roam. These boys bring justice, sending evil home. Cryptid lawmen, wild and free, hunting monsters for all to see. With silver bullets and grit of steel, they fight the darkness, make the demons squeal. From dusty canyons to moonlit plains, justice rides with wind and rains. Cryptid lawmen, a fearsome sight, standing tall against the endless night. Jed's a howler, claws of steel, Doc's a biter, makes the devil real. But DA's a shifty one, a shape-shifting soul, can turn to anything, takes any form, takes control. Tonight the chupacabras come to town, sucking the life from all around. But these lawmen, they ain't afraid, they'll face the darkness unafraid. Cryptid lawmen, wild and free, hunting monsters for all to see. With silver bullets and grit of steel, they fight the darkness, make the demons squeal. From dusty canyons to moonlit plains, justice rides with wind and rains. Cryptid lawmen, a fearsome sight, standing tall against the endless night. Full moon rises, bat wings flap, the air grows cold, a chill and trap. But these lawmen, they're ready to fight underneath the pale moonlight. Jed and Doc transform with a howl, DA shifts, becomes a night owl. Together they stand, a force so strong against the evil right in the road. Cryptid lawmen, wild and free, hunting monsters for all to see. With silver bullets and grit of steel, they fight the darkness, make the demons squeal. From dusty canyons to moonlit plains, justice rides with wind and rains. Cryptid lawmen, a fearsome sight, standing tall against the endless night.